There is a mountain in central Italy that broke armies. Not just one army, not in one season, but army after army, nation after nation, across months of cold and mud and fire, until the mountain had taken so much from so many that its name became something more than geography. It became a word for suffering, a word for the particular kind of war where everything costs more than it should, where every meter of ground is paid for twice, and where the men who fight and fall are often forgotten beneath the weight of the place that consumed them. That mountain is Monte Cassino, and tonight we are going to take you there. Settle in, find your position, because this is not a story that rushes, it earns its ending. And by the time we reach it, you will understand not just what happened on those frozen slopes in the winter and spring of 1944, but why it happened, how the decisions that shaped it were made, and what it cost the men who carried rifles up that hill and never came back down. This is the full story, the entire battle, from the first frost to the last flag. Let us begin where all great stories of war must begin, not with armies, not with generals, but with the ground itself. Italy, in the winter of 1943, is a country at war with its own terrain. The Allied forces who landed in the south that September believed they were opening a swift path northward. The Italian government had already signed an armistice. The logic seemed clean: push up the peninsula, take Rome, and strike at the heart of Axis Europe from below. It would be fast. It would be decisive. It would be, in the language of high command, a matter of weeks. The mountains had other ideas. The Italian peninsula is not a gentle corridor. It is a spine. The Apennines run the length of the country like a ridge of broken stone, and every valley, every river crossing, every exposed hilltop becomes a place where a small number of determined defenders can stop a large number of attackers cold. The Germans understood this. They had studied the map, and they built their defenses not to face the Allies in open battle, but to make the Allies pay in blood for every kilometre of elevation. The Winter Line, the defensive architecture that Field Marshal Albert Kesselring constructed across central Italy, was not a single wall. It was a system, a series of interlocking positions, each one supporting the others, each one designed to funnel Allied forces into killing grounds. And at the center of this system, rising roughly 600 meters above the valley floor, stood a single peak that controlled everything around it: Monte Cassino. From that summit, a German observer with binoculars could see for many kilometers in every direction. He could watch Allied columns move through the Liri Valley below. He could call in artillery with precision. He could make the road to Rome, Highway 6, the ancient Via Casalina, into something that no army could advance along without permission from the mountain above. And at the top of that mountain there was a monastery. The Abbey of Monte Cassino was not a young building. It had stood for more than 14 centuries. Founded by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, it had been destroyed before, by Lombards, by Saracens, by an earthquake, and rebuilt each time. It was one of the oldest continuously inhabited religious sites in the Western world. Its walls held manuscripts, artwork, and the accumulated history of European monasticism. Pilgrims had climbed that mountain for generations. Scholars had written within its cloisters. The building itself was the kind of thing that civilizations construct not just for faith, but as a statement about their own permanence. In January of 1944, American soldiers looked up at it from the frozen mud of the valley floor and saw only a problem. Because that is what war does to history. It turns monuments into obstacles. It turns centuries into complications. And the men who had to cross that valley, cold, exhausted, already depleted by months of fighting through the Italian winter, could not afford to think about the 14th century. They were trying to survive the 20th. What follows is one of the most debated, dissected, and devastating campaigns of the Second World War. It will unfold across 4 major assaults, spanning more than 4 months. It will involve soldiers from more than a dozen nations: Americans, British, New Zealanders, Indians, Poles, French, Moroccans, and others, each bringing their own history, their own doctrine, their own grief to the same impossible mountain. It will feature decisions that commanders would defend for the rest of their lives, and decisions that haunted them until they died. It will feature a bombing that shocked the world and helped almost no one. And it will end, finally, at enormous cost, with a flag raised over ruins, and a road opened, and a city liberated, and a question that never quite goes away: was any of it worth what it cost? That is the question this documentary will sit with, not to judge, but to understand. Because the men who fought at Monte Cassino deserve that, at minimum. They deserve to have their experience taken seriously, examined honestly, and carried forward by those of us who live in the world their sacrifice helped to shape. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for nights exactly like this one. Long, careful journeys through the history of conflict, told at the pace that history deserves. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, consider subscribing before we move on. There is a great deal more ahead, and tonight is just one chapter in a much longer library of stories we are building together. For those of you who have settled in before, who know how these nights unfold, get comfortable. We are going to be here for a while. The fire at Cassino burned for months. The cold never really lifted. The mountain never gave anything easily. And the story of what happened there is not a simple one of heroism and triumph, though there is heroism in it. It is a story of a campaign that outran its own assumptions, of commanders who faced choices with no good options, of soldiers who were asked to do things that human beings were perhaps never meant to do, and who did them anyway, because the alternative was worse. It is a story about what happens when strategy meets geography, when ambition meets reality, when the urgency of war collides with the weight of history. And it starts, as so many things in this war started, with a plan that seemed entirely reasonable until it met the ground. Close your eyes if you like. Let the words carry you. We are heading south now, into the Italian winter, into the valley below the mountain, into the story of Monte Cassino, the entire story, from the beginning. The war in Europe had many faces. It wore the face of frozen steppes in the east, of burning cities from the air, of hedgerows and beaches yet to come in the west. But in the winter of 1943, it wore the face of a mountain, not a dramatic peak wreathed in legend, not a summit that invited conquest, just a hard, cold, indifferent mass of rock, rising from the valley floor of central Italy, looking down on everything and giving nothing away. The men who first saw it from a distance, exhausted and muddy, carrying rifles and rations and the slow accumulation of months of fighting, could not have known then how long that mountain would hold them. They only knew it was there, and that between them and Rome, nothing else would matter quite so much. Italy had seemed, in the summer of 1943, like a door swinging open. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July had gone well enough. Mussolini had fallen. The Italian government had signed an armistice. There was a feeling, brief and fragile, that the soft underbelly of Europe, a phrase that had gained currency in strategic circles, might yield more easily than the fortified coastlines of the north. That feeling did not survive its first contact with German resolve. Within days of the armistice, German forces had flooded southward into Italy, disarming Italian soldiers, seizing key positions, and beginning the systematic construction of what would become one of the most formidable defensive networks of the entire war. The door that had seemed to swing open swung shut again, and it was made of steel. The terrain of southern and central Italy was not incidental to what followed. It was everything. The Italian peninsula runs from northwest to southeast, and its spine is a chain of mountains, the Apennines, that divides the country lengthwise and makes lateral movement difficult, sometimes impossible. Roads and rivers run in valleys, and valleys funnel armies into predictable corridors. Whoever commands the high ground commands the valley, and whoever commands the valley commands the road. And in 1943, the roads that led north led to Rome. The Germans understood this with complete clarity. They did not need to hold every mountain or defend every river crossing. They needed only to choose the right ones, reinforce them with concrete and wire and guns, and wait. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, chose brilliantly. Running across the width of the peninsula south of Rome, he constructed what Allied planners called the Winter Line, a series of interlocking defensive positions that used mountains, rivers, and valleys not as obstacles to be endured, but as weapons to be wielded. The line was not a single wall, it was a system, layered and mutually supporting, each position covered by fire from another, each approach overlooked by height. The Gustav Line sat at the heart of it, anchored on the western side by a feature that Kesselring recognized immediately as irreplaceable: the Rapido River, the town of Cassino in the valley below, and above it, rising 600 meters from the valley floor, the mountain that the Allies would come to know simply as Monte Cassino. What stood at the top of that mountain had stood there for 14 centuries. The Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino was one of the oldest monasteries in the Western world, founded by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across the long span of European history, and still inhabited in 1943 by monks who had remained through the gathering storm. The structure that crowned the summit was massive, thick stone walls enclosing courtyards and chapels and libraries, a building that looked less like a place of quiet worship and more like a fortress, because across the centuries it had sometimes been exactly that. From its windows and terraces, a man with binoculars could see for enormous distances in every direction. The Liri Valley opened below like a map. Highway 6, the road that ran through Cassino and northward toward Rome, was visible from end to end. Nothing moved in the valley without being visible from that height. The Allied advance north through Italy had been grinding and costly long before it reached the Winter Line. The landings at Salerno in September of 1943 had nearly been thrown back into the sea by fierce German counterattacks. The subsequent advance up the Italian boot had been slow, contested at every river crossing, every ridge, every town that could be fortified and held. By November, Allied forces had made contact with the outer works of the Winter Line, and their momentum, already worn thin by weeks of fighting in difficult terrain, began to falter. The men doing the fighting were not inadequate. They were, by any measure, soldiers of quality. Americans, British, Canadians, French, Indians, New Zealanders, and others drawn from across the Allied world. But quality of soldier could not easily overcome quality of ground, and the ground here was perfectly suited to those who waited, and perfectly punishing to those who moved. By December of 1943, the Allied advance had effectively stopped. Units that had been moving, even slowly, now found themselves holding positions in mud and cold, looking up at heights they could not reach. The Rapido River, shallow enough to wade in summer, was running high and fast and cold. The ground on both sides was flat and open and covered by German guns. The approaches to Monte Cassino from the south and west offered almost no cover, scrub and rock and exposed slope, every meter of it registered by German artillery. Every movement at night met with flares and machine gun fire. The forward positions of the Allied line became places where men endured rather than advanced, where survival from one morning to the next was its own kind of achievement. The human cost of this stalemate was real and accumulating quietly. Casualty reports were filed, replacements arrived, units rotated in and out of the line when rotation was possible. But the particular misery of a winter stalemate in mountains is not always captured in numbers. It is wet boots and frozen fingers and the inability to sleep in a position under observation. It is rations that arrive cold or not at all, and the particular fear of a man who knows that every path he might use to move forward or backward has been watched and ranged by men who have had weeks to prepare. It is the slow erosion of the expectation that things will get better, replaced by the dull management of the fact that things are exactly as bad as they appear. Thousands of men lived that reality through November and December, with Monte Cassino always present above them, catching the winter light, impassive. Allied commanders looking at their maps in the closing weeks of 1943 could see the problem with complete clarity, which made it no less insoluble. The Liri Valley, the natural corridor to Rome, was blocked at its mouth by the Cassino position. To attack through the valley without first controlling the heights was to advance under observed fire from above, which was operationally unacceptable. To take the heights required attacking up slopes that offered virtually no cover against defenders who had prepared their positions with great care in winter weather that stripped every advantage from the attacker. To bypass the position entirely would require crossing the Apennines in force, which the terrain and the season rendered nearly impossible. Every option led back to the same conclusion. The mountain had to be taken, and the mountain did not intend to be taken easily. There was also the question of time, and time was not a neutral factor. The broader war was moving. Planning for the invasion of Northwest Europe was consuming men, material, and attention. The resources available to the Italian campaign were not infinite, and there were those in Allied councils who questioned whether Italy was worth what it was costing. The pressure on commanders in the field to produce results, to show that the Italian campaign could achieve something decisive before the weight of Allied effort shifted elsewhere, was constant and, in its own way, as grinding as the terrain. Rome was not merely a city. It was the first capital of a major Axis power to fall within reach of Allied armies, and its symbolic value was enormous. It sat approximately 140 kilometers north of Monte Cassino, close enough to seem tantalizingly possible, and far enough to feel, in the winter of 1943, almost mythical. The mountain had not fallen. It would not fall in the first weeks of 1944, nor the second. What was beginning, though none of the men who shivered at its base could have fully understood the scale of it, was one of the most prolonged and costly single engagements of the Western Allied campaign. A battle that would absorb armies from across the world, reshape doctrines about terrain and bombardment and the limits of military force, and leave a mark on the ground and on memory that has not faded in the decades since. Monte Cassino was not yet the name of a battle. It was still just a mountain. But mountains, the men of the Winter Line were learning, can be more than geography. They can become ideas, fixed, immovable, resistant to everything brought against them. And ideas, as every general who has ever faced one knows, are the hardest things in the world to dislodge. There is a kind of military mind that looks at a mountain and sees not beauty, not history, not the quiet permanence of stone, but geometry, angles of fire, dead ground, the elevation required to watch an enemy move and kill him before he reaches you. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring possessed precisely that kind of mind, and when he turned it toward the spine of central Italy in the autumn of 1943, what he saw was not a country. What he saw was a fortress waiting to be built. Kesselring was not a man who inspired the dramatic mythology that clung to other German commanders of the era. He was not theatrical. He was not given to grand proclamations or the performance of genius. What he was, above everything else, was thorough. He had served as a Luftwaffe officer before transitioning to ground command, and that background gave him something rare. A comprehensive understanding of how ground and air power interlocked, how terrain shaped not just infantry movement, but the reach of artillery, the approach of bombers, the logic of supply. When he was appointed Commander-in-Chief South, he inherited a peninsula that most German strategic planners considered a liability. Kesselring chose to treat it as a gift. Italy's geography had always been unkind to invaders moving from the south. The peninsula narrows as it rises northward, compressed between two coastlines close enough that any army advancing up its length must squeeze through corridors defined entirely by the mountains that run along its spine. The Apennines are not decorative. They are ancient, severe, and deeply inhospitable to mechanized forces. Rivers cut laterally across the width of the country, flowing west and east from the central heights to the sea, each one a natural barrier perpendicular to the direction of any Allied advance. Kesselring read this geography the way a musician reads a score, not passively, but as a set of instructions. Every river was a defensive line. Every ridge was a prepared position. Every valley mouth was a killing ground in waiting. Through the late summer and into the autumn of 1943, German engineers worked with extraordinary speed and precision across the length of the Italian peninsula. The Gustav Line, the most formidable of the defensive belts Kesselring designed, ran roughly east to west across the narrowest part of central Italy, anchored in the east on the Sangro River and in the west on the Garigliano, with Monte Cassino at its absolute center. This was not a single trench or a line of wire. It was a system, layered, mutually supporting, designed to absorb punishment and redistribute it. Concrete bunkers were sunk into hillsides and camouflaged until they were invisible from the air. Anti-tank ditches were carved across the valley floors. Artillery positions were registered, meaning gunners had precisely calculated the range and bearing to every approach road, every bridge, every ford, so that shells could be directed by map reference alone, even at night, even through cloud. The engineering was methodical and devastating in its thoroughness. The Winter Line, as the Allies called the broader complex of German defences that preceded the Gustav, represented something more than a temporary holding measure. It was a philosophical statement about how Kesselring intended to fight this campaign. He did not believe Italy could be held forever. He had no illusions about that, but he believed, correctly, as events would prove, that the terrain gave a determined defender an enormous asymmetric advantage. A relatively small number of well-positioned German soldiers could force a vastly larger Allied force to pay in blood for every kilometre of advance. Every week the Allies spent grinding southward against these positions was a week they were not elsewhere. Every division tied down in the Italian mud was a division not crossing the Channel, not pressing into Germany from the west. Kesselring's Italy was never about winning. It was about making the cost of losing as high as possible for the other side. Adolf Hitler's interest in the Italian theatre went beyond strategic calculation and into something more personal. The humiliation of Italy's armistice in September 1943, the defection of an Axis partner, the chaos of disarming Italian forces across the peninsula had been a political wound. Hitler made clear to his commanders that there would be no further retreat south of Rome without his explicit authorization. The Eternal City carried symbolic weight that transcended purely military logic. Rome was one of the great capitals of European civilization, and its fall to Anglo-American forces would be understood everywhere, in neutral countries, in occupied territories, in the homes of ordinary Germans following the war through censored newspapers, as a sign that the tide had genuinely turned. Kesselring, who was professionally skeptical of political interference in military decisions, nonetheless found that Hitler's insistence on holding aligned reasonably well with his own assessment. The terrain made holding practical, the politics made it mandatory. It was within this context that Monte Cassino began its transformation from a geographic feature into a strategic obsession. The mountain rose roughly 600 meters above the surrounding valley floor, a blunt and commanding presence that dominated the junction of the Rapido and Lieri rivers. Anyone who controlled its summit could observe almost every Allied approach route in the region. Forward artillery observers positioned on its heights, or even on the surrounding ridgelines that formed its shoulders, could call down fire onto roads, supply columns, troop concentrations, and river crossings with devastating precision. This was not theoretical. It was the lived reality of every Allied soldier who moved through the valley below, exposed and watched, feeling in the small hours of the morning the particular helplessness of being seen by an enemy you cannot locate. The Benedictine monastery that crowned the summit had stood, in one form or another, for 14 centuries. Founded in the 6th century, it had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across the span of European history, by Lombard raiders, by Saracen incursions, by earthquake. Each time it rose again, larger and more magnificent than before, until by the 20th century it was among the finest examples of Baroque ecclesiastical architecture on the continent. Its walls enclosed a library, priceless artworks, centuries of accumulated manuscript and material culture. It was by any measure a monument that belonged to the whole of human civilization rather than to any nation or army. And yet it sat precisely where no monument should sit, in the middle of a modern war, at the apex of the most contested ridge in the Mediterranean theatre. German policy regarding the monastery was publicly clear and privately complicated. The Vatican had pressed for assurances that the structure would be respected, and German commanders formally declared a zone of exclusion around it. No German military personnel were to occupy the buildings themselves. No weapons were to be positioned within the walls. There is credible evidence that, at least in the early stages of the campaign, these restrictions were honored in a technical sense. German officers coordinated with the monastery's abbot to remove artworks and archives to safety further north, a measure that preserved cultural treasures that might otherwise have been lost entirely. German paratroopers from the elite 1st Parachute Division occupied the slopes and ridgelines surrounding the monastery, dug into the rocks and rubble of the mountain itself, but pointed to the unoccupied walls above them as evidence of restraint. What Allied observers saw from below was something less clear-cut. The monastery's massive white walls and towers formed an obvious landmark on the summit, and from its windows, from its outer terraces, from any position on the structure's exterior, an observer equipped with binoculars could watch the entire valley spread out beneath him like a map. Whether German soldiers were inside those walls taking formal observation was almost impossible to determine from a distance. The distinction between the monastery's outer boundary and the German positions immediately adjacent to it blurred with every passing week of close combat and artillery exchange. Soldiers operating under fire in darkness and cold and exhaustion are not well positioned to draw fine distinctions about property lines on a hilltop they cannot reach. Kesselring's engineers continued their work through November and December, improving positions, deepening bunkers, stringing wire, pre-registering targets. The 1st Parachute Division, hardened veterans of Crete, of North Africa, of Sicily, settled into the Cassino Massif with the particular competence of elite soldiers who had learned their trade in the most brutal possible schools. They built fighting positions in the natural rock faces, created interconnected tunnels and crawlways that allowed movement between positions without exposure to fire from above. They prepared for the assault they knew was coming with the calm professionalism of men who had survived this kind of fighting before and intended to survive it again. When Allied forces began their approach in January of 1944, they were not walking toward a military position that had been improvised under pressure. They were walking toward something that had been designed, engineered, and occupied by some of the finest defensive infantry in the world. The mountain had not simply been occupied, it had been transformed into something that would require a terrible price to take away. By the close of 1943, the Allied High Command in the Mediterranean faced a problem that maps alone could not solve. Italy had seemed, from a distance, like a promising route toward the heart of occupied Europe, a soft underbelly, in the phrase that had circulated among planners and politicians alike. The reality on the ground told a different story. The peninsula was a corridor of ridges, ravines, and river crossings that compressed attacking forces into narrow killing grounds and handed every natural advantage to a determined defender. Roads that appeared serviceable on paper dissolved into mud rivers under the weight of armored columns and winter rain. The mountains did not merely complicate the advance, they swallowed it. Every kilometre won northward came at a cost that the planners back in London and Washington had not fully reckoned with, and the arithmetic of attrition was beginning to disturb even the most optimistic voices in the campaign. Into this predicament stepped General Harold Alexander, a careful and politically adroit British officer who carried responsibility for the entire 15th Army Group, the combined force that encompassed both the British 8th Army on the Adriatic flank and the American 5th Army pressing up the western side of the peninsula. Alexander possessed a gift for managing fractious alliances and strong-willed subordinates, smoothing tensions with a diplomat's instinct while still prosecuting the campaign with genuine professionalism. His task was not simply military. Above the immediate question of breaking German lines lay a strategic imperative handed down from the highest levels of the Allied coalition. Rome had to fall, and it had to fall before the massive amphibious operation planned for the French coast consumed the men, ships, and air resources currently committed to Italy. The window was closing, measured not in vague seasonal terms but in hard logistical deadlines that could not be moved. Alexander understood that if his forces could not force a breakthrough in the weeks immediately ahead, the momentum of the entire Mediterranean campaign would effectively stall while the war's center of gravity shifted elsewhere. The weight of that deadline shaped every decision made in the Fifth Army's forward headquarters during those winter weeks. Rome sat roughly 140 kilometers north of the German lines, close enough on a map to seem tantalizingly within reach, yet separated from Allied soldiers by the full depth of Kesselring's prepared defenses. The Winter Line, anchored at its most formidable point around the Cassino Massif, was not a single trench or a thin screen of outposts. It was a layered system of mutually supporting positions, reinforced with concrete and steel, sited to make every approach a gauntlet. The Liri Valley, which offered the most natural corridor toward Rome, funneled any attacker directly beneath the heights of Monte Cassino, where German observers could watch the entire front spread out below them like a military exercise. Any force trying to drive up that valley without first neutralizing the heights would be advancing under constant scrutiny, its movements anticipated, its concentrations shelled before they could develop momentum. The geography had placed a lock on the road to Rome, and Cassino was the key. It was within this context that the idea of an amphibious landing to the north of the German lines began to gather serious momentum. The concept was not new. Using sea power to bypass fixed defenses and strike at an enemy's rear had been discussed in various forms since the campaign moved onto the Italian mainland. But now the idea acquired a specific shape and a specific champion. General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, was a tall, angular American officer of considerable ambition and restless energy, who had been pushing the Italian campaign with a ferocity that reflected both genuine commitment and acute awareness of his own historical position. Clark believed, with a conviction that his staff found persuasive and his critics found dangerous, that a landing near the small port town of Anzio could sever the German supply lines running down to the Winter Line and force Kesselring to abandon his mountain fortresses rather than risk having his entire force cut off and destroyed. The logic was seductive in its clarity. Anzio lay roughly 60 kilometers south of Rome, positioned behind the bulk of the German defensive system. A force landed there would not be fighting through mountains. It would be operating on the relatively flat Pontine Plain, close to the road and rail networks that kept the German divisions at Cassino supplied and reinforced. If that force moved quickly enough, it could interdict those arteries, threatening the German rear so seriously that Kesselring would have no choice but to thin his lines at Cassino or order a general withdrawal. Meanwhile, the Fifth Army would press forward from the south, sensing any weakness that the redeployment created, and the two Allied forces would converge on Rome from different directions before the Germans could reorganize. On paper, the operation resolved the grinding stalemate with a stroke of operational creativity that bypassed the mountain's terrible defensive advantages entirely. But the plan rested on assumptions that were, even at the time, recognized by cooler heads as fragile. The forces available for the landing were limited. The same logistical constraints that pressed Alexander on the timeline also capped the size of the Anzio force, which could not be so large that it stripped the main front of the strength needed to keep pressure on Cassino while the landing developed. The fleet of landing craft required for the operation had been argued over at the highest Allied levels, with competing demands from other theatres constantly threatening to pull shipping away from the Mediterranean. What eventually remained was enough to put a substantial force ashore at Anzio, but perhaps not enough to sustain it through a prolonged fight if German resistance proved faster and more organized than anticipated. The entire plan balanced on the speed of the initial exploitation. The landing force would need to move inland with enough aggression to reach the Alban Hills and the road networks beyond, before Kesselring could assemble the forces to contain it. There was a further complication that the planners acknowledged but could not fully resolve. The timing between the Anzio landing and the breakout attempt at Cassino had to be synchronized with a precision that the weather, the terrain, and the enemy would all conspire to disrupt. If the main front failed to break through quickly enough after the landing, the Anzio force would find itself isolated on a coastal plain, surrounded by German divisions rushing south from Rome and north from the Cassino sector. The beachhead would then become not a dagger at the enemy's back, but a defended enclosure that the Allies would be obligated to hold and supply across open water, consuming the very resources they had hoped to liberate for the drive on Rome. The risk was structural. built into the geometry of the operation itself, and the men who understood it most clearly tended to be those with the least power to change the fundamental design. Alexander approved the plan, calibrating his support with the measured pragmatism that characterized his command style. He was not insensible to the risks, but he was equally aware of the risks of inaction. A campaign that continued to bleed Allied strength against immovable German positions while producing nothing of strategic value was not a conservative option. It was simply a slower form of failure. The political pressure from London and Washington was real and sustained. Prime Minister Churchill, who had championed the Italian campaign against skeptics who preferred to concentrate everything on the northern French operation, needed Italy to produce results that justified his strategic judgment. Roosevelt's advisors were watching the manpower and material costs mount with growing impatience. For Alexander, the Anzio gamble was not recklessness. It was the least bad option available to a commander who had been handed an extremely difficult strategic position and told to produce a victory before a fixed date. The planning proceeded with the organized intensity that major amphibious operations demanded. Staffs worked through the mechanics of embarkation, naval fire support, air cover, and the logistical tail required to sustain a force once it came ashore. Commanders reviewed the beaches, studied the terrain north of the landing zone, and wargamed the critical hours after the first waves reached the shore. The operation was assigned a name and given a target date in January of 1944. Ships began assembling in harbors along the coast. The men who would make the landing, American, British, and other Allied soldiers, prepared their equipment and were told as much as security allowed. Among the officers who would carry out the assault, there was genuine confidence mixed with the particular alertness that experienced soldiers develop when a plan asks them to move fast and far before the enemy recovers its balance. What could not be fully planned was the human dimension of the moment, the decisions that individual commanders would make in the first hours ashore, when the textbook scenario would begin dissolving into the noise and confusion of actual contact. The entire logic of the Anzio operation depended on boldness in that initial phase, on a willingness to drive inland before the Germans could react, rather than consolidating methodically on the beach. Whether that boldness would materialize was not a question that any staff officer could answer in advance. It lived in the character and temperament of the men who would be standing on Italian soil, with the Alban hills in front of them and the sea behind them, deciding how far and how fast to push. And so the two operations moved toward execution together. The direct assault on Cassino from the south, meant to hold German attention and stretch their reserves, and the amphibious hook at Anzio, meant to unbalance the entire defensive system in a single morning. Each depended on the other. Each carried within it the assumption that the enemy would not react faster than the plan required. It was a bold design shaped by genuine strategic need and genuine strategic urgency, forged in the particular pressure of a campaign that had already cost more than anyone had expected and had so far produced less than anyone had promised. The mountains still stood. The road to Rome was still closed, and the men who would try to open it were moving into position. The mountain watched everything. From its 600-meter height, the ancient Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino commanded a view that no military planner could ignore and no honest soldier could pretend away. To the south and west, the Liri Valley lay open like a map drawn by a careful hand. Roads, bridges, troop movements, supply convoys, artillery positions, all of it visible from the summit on a clear winter morning. Allied commanders staring up at those white walls through field glasses understood instinctively what the Germans had understood from the first weeks of occupation. Whoever held the high ground here held the key to the valley below, and whoever held the valley held the road to Rome. The abbey had stood for 14 centuries through invasion, earthquake, and ruin, rebuilt each time by Benedictine hands that believed stone and faith were permanent things. Now those same walls entered a different kind of reckoning, not theological, not architectural, but strategic, and the men tasked with breaking the winter line were beginning to ask a question that had no comfortable answer. Were the Germans inside? The question sounds simple. In the winter of 1943, moving into 1944, it was anything but. Allied intelligence had accumulated a patchwork of reports, aerial photographs, and accounts from refugees and prisoners, none of them conclusive, all of them pointing in slightly different directions. Some reports described German soldiers moving freely around the monastery grounds. Others spoke of observation posts positioned on the outer walls or in the bell tower, directing artillery fire down onto Allied positions with frightening precision. Soldiers on the slopes below had watched shells land with a consistency that suggested correction from above. Someone, somewhere up there, was watching and calling. The Allies were being seen. The Allies were being killed by information that seemed to flow from that summit. And yet, the monastery itself had been declared a protected zone. The agreement existed on paper and, at least officially, in principle. German military authorities had given assurances that the abbey and its immediate grounds would be respected as a cultural monument. The Benedictine monks remained inside the walls, along with a number of Italian civilians who had sought shelter as the fighting moved northward. The abbot, a man of considerable dignity and composure, maintained that no German soldiers were stationed within the monastery itself, that German troops had kept a respectful boundary around the walls. Vatican diplomatic channels reinforced the message. The structure was neutral ground, protected by both international convention and the personal commitment of German officers who understood, or claimed to understand, the weight of what stood before them. Allied commanders received these assurances with varying degrees of skepticism. Some believed them entirely. Others found them operationally irrelevant. Whether German soldiers were technically inside the walls or positioned just outside them, the summit still functioned as an observation advantage of the First Order. General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, and nursing the frustration of a campaign that had already cost far more than anyone in Washington or London had anticipated, was among those who leaned toward skepticism, not necessarily about the letter of the German assurances, but about their practical meaning. A hilltop with walls, windows, and a commanding view of the battlefield does not need a soldier standing at every window to provide military value. The structure's existence, its geometry, its elevation, these things served the defense whether German paratroopers slept inside or simply moved in its shadow. The friction between military necessity and cultural preservation was not new in the winter of 1944. Armies had been destroying monuments, cathedrals, libraries, and ancient structures since warfare began. But the scale and visibility of what was happening at Monte Cassino made the question unusually pointed. This was not a crumbling ruin in a forgotten province. The Abbey of Monte Cassino was one of the founding sites of Western monasticism, a place where Saint Benedict himself had lived and written in the 6th century, a structure older than most nations, and recognized as spiritually and historically irreplaceable across the entire Christian world. Bombing it would not be a military footnote, it would be a statement, whether intended or not, heard far beyond the Liri Valley. Officers who understood this argued carefully and at length. Some pointed to the intelligence gaps. The photographs were inconclusive, the prisoner accounts were contradictory, the refugees were frightened and not always reliable. Without definitive proof of German military use, bombing the monastery would be destroying a heritage site on the basis of suspicion alone. Others pushed back with equal force. Definitive proof, in battle, is a luxury that soldiers do not often receive before they die. Men were being killed on those slopes by fire that seemed directed from above, and the cost of being wrong about the monastery's neutrality fell entirely on Allied infantry. The men climbing those slopes in the freezing dark of January did not have the luxury of philosophical deliberation. They had machine guns pointed at them, and the choice to advance or retreat. Aerial reconnaissance missions were flown repeatedly, cameras clicking over the summit in attempts to resolve the question from the air. The photographs came back showing the monastery's walls intact, its courtyards quiet, the surrounding terrain scarred and fortified with the unmistakable geometry of German defensive works. Bunkers, trenches, weapon pits cut into the rock along the approaches. What the photographs could not show was what happened inside the walls when no aircraft were overhead. They could not capture the moment a German officer raised field glasses to a window, or the instant a radio operator relayed a grid coordinate to a waiting artillery battery below. Photography from altitude in 1944 was precise enough to reveal armored vehicles, but too limited to prove or disprove the movement of a single man through a doorway. The intelligence picture was not a picture at all. It was a fog, shaped by pressure and fear and the desperate desire to find a justification or a reason to hesitate. Different commanders read the same fragmentary evidence and reached different conclusions, and the conclusions they reached often corresponded to the pressure they were already feeling. Those pushing for the bombing had armies stalled in the mud below, and casualties mounting by the day. Those urging restraint had reputations, relationships with the Vatican, and a genuine horror at the precedent being set. There was no neutral position here. Not acting was also a choice, and it had its own body count. Into this argument stepped General Bernard Freyberg, commanding the 2nd New Zealand Corps and the 4th Indian Division, fresh forces being prepared for what everyone hoped would be a more decisive assault on the mountain. Freyberg was not a man given to lengthy second-guessing. He was a decorated soldier, hardened by multiple wars, and he brought to the casino question the directness of someone who had already seen more men die than most commanders cared to count. Before he would commit his divisions to the slopes, he demanded clarity. Not certainty. He understood that certainty was unavailable, but clarity about what his men were being asked to do, and whether they were being asked to attack into fire directed from a protected monument. He pressed for a decision. The question of the monastery could not remain a question indefinitely while soldiers bled below it. The pressure concentrated. Diplomatic cables moved between commanders, Vatican representatives, and political authorities. Some British officers expressed deep discomfort with the direction things were moving, arguing that bombing the abbey would provide a propaganda victory to the German government, regardless of military outcome. Destroy the monastery, the argument went, and Germany's propagandists would spend the rest of the war, and the years after, holding the ruins up as evidence of Allied barbarism. The Germans, meanwhile, could claim the moral high ground from behind the very rubble Allied bombers created. It was a troubling possibility, and it was correct. It would happen almost exactly as predicted. And yet the military logic, for those who had to weigh it against the infantry toll, was becoming harder to resist. The approach from the south was a killing ground. German positions on the slopes had shown a quality of coordination and accuracy that suggested direction from somewhere elevated. The monastery, whatever German assurances maintained, occupied the highest point on the most important terrain feature in the entire theatre. Every day the debate continued. Men were dying. Every night the temperatures fell and the wounded froze on slopes that had not moved forward by a single meter. The cultural argument was real. The military argument was real. Both were entirely true, and they pointed in opposite directions, and someone had to choose. The decision, when it came, did not arrive with the clarity that anyone had hoped for. It arrived as decisions in exhausted campaigns often do, gradually, then all at once, pushed forward by accumulated pressure and the simple impossibility of remaining suspended between two unbearable options. Authorization would be given, the monastery would be bombed, and in the immediate aftermath, those who had argued for restraint would find themselves proved right about the propaganda consequences, while those who had argued for the strike would find themselves proved right about something equally terrible. That rubble, it turned out, made an even better fortress than standing walls. The question of the monastery had been asked through the winter of early 1944. The answer, when it came on the 15th of February, would not resolve anything. It would only change the nature of the problem, trading one kind of impossibility for another, and leaving the mountain standing, unconquered and unrelenting, above the valley it had always owned. The Italian winter of 1944 was not the winter of postcards and mountain stillness. It was a cold that worked its way through every seam and every layer, settling into the joints of men who had already marched too far on too little sleep. The roads south of Monte Cassino had been ground into mud by the passage of tanks, artillery pieces, and supply convoys that moved in fits and starts through the grey light of short days. American soldiers of the Fifth Army looked up at the mountain from positions in the valley below and saw something that defied easy comprehension, a rock face that rose above them like a wall at the edge of the known world. The monastery at its crown reduced by distance to a pale smudge against the sky. They had been told the German line would crack. They had been told momentum was on their side. They had been told, in the cautious language of military briefings, that the winter line could not hold indefinitely against sustained Allied pressure. What they had not been told, what no briefing could adequately convey, was how completely and deliberately the mountain had been turned against them. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army had been pressing northward through Italy for months by the time January 1944 arrived. The soldiers under his command were not fresh troops arriving from training camps with their equipment still clean and their confidence still intact. These were men who had already fought their way up the length of the Italian boot, through the Volturno crossings and the mud of the autumn campaigns, through engagements that had cost them more than they were supposed to cost according to the timetables drawn up in the comfortable remove of strategic planning. The Fifth Army was composed of diverse formations, American divisions, French Expeditionary Corps units that included North African and Moroccan soldiers, and supporting elements drawn from across the Allied coalition. Together they were a capable force, but capability and condition are not the same thing, and by January these men were carrying the particular exhaustion that accumulates when soldiers have been fighting too long without adequate rest. They needed a breakthrough not just strategically but psychologically, a moment when the grinding forward progress would suddenly accelerate and the road to Rome would open before them. Monte Cassino stood between them and that moment. The French Expeditionary Corps, commanded by General Alphonse Juin, was assigned the task of pushing through the mountains to the north of Cassino, the Colli Eterni sector, in a maneuver designed to outflank the main defences and open an approach that the Germans might not have reinforced as thoroughly as the direct routes. Juin's soldiers included experienced North African troops who had fought in difficult terrain before and who brought with them a particular understanding of mountain movement that set them apart from conventional infantry trained for open-field warfare. In the first days of January, These forces made gains that briefly seemed to justify the optimism of the planners. They pushed into the high ground, enduring temperatures that dropped sharply after dark, and supply lines that stretched back across terrain that was hostile to vehicles and difficult even for mules. The promise of those early gains, however, would become one of the crueler ironies of the campaign. Progress made in one sector that could not be exploited because it outran the capacity of supporting formations to keep pace. To the south and directly facing the town of Cassino and the mountain above it, American formations prepared to force crossings of the Rapido River, a name that would become, in the memory of the soldiers who fought there, synonymous with futility and grief. The Rapido was not a wide river, but width has never been the measure of a river's danger to attacking infantry. The German defenders had spent weeks turning every approach to the crossing points into a killing ground. Minefields had been laid in the darkness and the mud, the positions marked in the minds of engineers who knew exactly where every wire and every pressure plate had been placed. Machine gun positions covered the banks with interlocking fields of fire, positioned so that movement in any direction offered no sanctuary. Artillery had been pre-ranged on the crossing points, the coordinates worked out in advance so that guns could be brought to bear quickly and accurately the moment Allied soldiers appeared at the water's edge. The men tasked with crossing the Rapido knew, or sensed, that they were being asked to do something that the ground itself was conspiring to prevent. The assault crossing of the Rapido began in darkness, as such attacks must, when the alternative is advancing in full view of defenders who hold the high ground. Engineers struggled to bring assault boats forward across terrain that seemed designed to swallow equipment and exhaust the men carrying it. The mud that clung to boots and wheels and skids added weight to every load and slowed every movement. Boats were lost before they ever reached the water, overturned or holed in the darkness, their crews trying to salvage what could be salvaged, while German flares arced upward and turned the night into a flickering half-light that revealed shapes without confirming them. When men did reach the river and push across, they landed on the far bank into a landscape that had been prepared for their destruction. The minefields claimed soldiers in the dark, explosions that announced a position to every German gun within range. The machine guns swept the approaches. The artillery came down on the crossing points, breaking the boats and the men who had not yet boarded them. Within the first hours, it was clear to commanders on the ground that what was unfolding was not an assault stalling momentarily before gathering itself. It was an assault being systematically dismantled. Units that crossed in sufficient numbers to hold a position found themselves cut off when subsequent waves could not get across. Communication between the far bank and the command posts on the near side was unreliable. Messages going silent as the men who carried radios were killed or wounded, and the picture of what was happening grew fragmentary and confused. The decisions that had to be made, to push more men forward into the same fire, or to pull back and accept that the crossing had failed, were the kind of decisions that commanders spend careers hoping they will never face. Some chose to keep pushing, feeding more men into the attempt, because stopping felt like abandoning those already across. The costs compounded in the dark. Up on the mountain itself, and in the approaches to the town of Cassino below the summit, the experience was different in its physical character, but identical in its outcome. Where the Rapido crossing was a struggle against a river and a fortified bank, the mountain assault was a struggle against gravity, cold, and the near impossibility of moving quietly enough through rocky terrain to avoid triggering the defenses that waited above. German paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division, elite soldiers who had chosen this ground and studied it, held the high positions with a discipline and steadiness that impressed even those who were trying to kill them. They had ranged every approach, They knew the gullies and the ridgelines and the false summits that looked like cover and were not. When Allied soldiers climbed toward them through the freezing darkness, they waited with the patience of men who understood that the ground was doing much of their work for them. The French forces in the mountains to the north had made the most significant gains of the entire January effort, pushing into positions that in different circumstances might have been exploited to pry the German line open. But exploiting a gain requires reserves, and reserves require the rest of the line to hold its ground and advance in coordination. The American effort along the Rapido had not provided the kind of pressure that would force the German command to strip defenders from other sectors to plug gaps. Instead, the Rapido crossings had failed with such completeness that German commanders could assess their flanks as stable, leaving Ewan's forces exposed at the end of a long advance without the support needed to go further. The mountain soldiers who had climbed highest and fought hardest now had to come back down through the same terrain, carrying their casualties, surrendering the ground they had bought at such cost. By the end of January, the picture across the entire Cassino front was one of armies that had spent enormous energy and lives without achieving the breakthrough that had been the premise of the whole effort. The casualty figures accumulating in the records of Fifth Army were staggering. Thousands of men killed, wounded, or missing across the different operations. Numbers that represented not abstract strategic setbacks, but the specific destruction of specific soldiers who had names and histories and people waiting for them somewhere further from the mountain. The German defenders had absorbed the Allied effort and held their positions, demonstrating that Kesselring's construction of the Winter Line had not been an exercise in theoretical fortification, but a genuine system of interlocking defense that the terrain itself reinforced at every point. In the command posts and headquarters behind the Allied lines, the failure produced both recrimination and reassessment. There were those who argued that the attacks had been pressed with insufficient force, that more men thrown forward earlier might have broken through before the Germans could react. There were those who argued the opposite, that the failures had been failures of planning, that the decision to assault directly across the Rapido against prepared defences had been a choice that no amount of courage could redeem. The debate over the Rapido crossings would outlast the war, becoming one of the most examined and contested decisions of the entire Italian campaign. For the men who had survived those nights on the river and the mountain, the debates of their commanders were a distant thing. They were cold and tired, and the mountain was still there above them, unchanged, holding everything it had held before they began. The Germans had understood something about Monte Cassino that the Allied commanders were still in the process of learning through the hard instruction of failed assaults. The mountain was not simply a terrain feature to be taken and moved past on the way to something else. It was a position that multiplied the value of every defender holding it and multiplied the cost of every soldier sent against it. Kesselring's men had not simply occupied the high ground, they had become part of it, integrating themselves into the rock and rubble with the thoroughness of soldiers who intended to stay. Against that kind of defense, the first assault had accomplished something that no one had intended. It had demonstrated the true scale of the problem. The price of Monte Cassino had not yet reached its final reckoning, but the first installment had been paid in full, and the mountain had not moved. The slopes below Monte Cassino had swallowed men whole through January and into early February of 1944. The ground was not simply contested, it was saturated, every ridge and gully carrying the memory of the soldiers who had tried to climb it and failed. American battalions had been ground down past the point of usefulness. French colonial troops, fighting with extraordinary skill and ferocity, had pushed where others could not, but found themselves unable to hold what they had taken, without reinforcement, that never came in sufficient numbers. The commanders who looked at the mountain now did not see an obstacle awaiting the right solution. They saw something more unsettling, a problem that had already consumed every answer offered to it. Into this frozen, exhausted impasse, fresh formations began to arrive. They carried with them the weight of expectation, and the mountain would test every ounce of it. The formations that drew the most attention were two in particular. The 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Corps and the 4th Indian Division arrived in the Cassino sector as representatives of an empire still stretched across the globe, still drawing on the loyalty and sacrifice of men from continents far removed from the Italian winter. The New Zealanders were not new to war. They had fought in Greece, in Crete, across the desert of North Africa, accumulating hard knowledge at enormous cost. The Indian Division carried its own record of sustained combat, its soldiers having served in conditions as varied and brutal as warfare offered. These were not fresh-faced units unfamiliar with what a determined enemy could do. They understood the grammar of modern battle. What they did not yet understand, and would need to learn quickly, was the particular and unforgiving dialect spoken by Monte Cassino. Command of this combined force fell to Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, a New Zealander whose reputation preceded him like a weather front. He had won the Victoria Cross in the First World War, had commanded with distinction through North Africa, and carried the kind of authority that came from being seen and surviving where others had not. His subordinates respected him with something close to reverence. His superiors found him both invaluable and formidable, a commander who would not simply absorb an order and execute it without question if the order struck him as inadequately prepared. This quality had served him well in other theatres. On the approaches to Cassino, it would place him at the centre of one of the most contentious decisions of the entire Italian campaign. Freyberg looked at what the previous assaults had cost, studied the ground carefully, and arrived at a conclusion that he held with the stubbornness of a man accustomed to being right when others were wrong. He would not send his men up those slopes without first resolving the question of the monastery. The ancient Benedictine abbey of Monte Cassino sat at the peak like a crown, its massive stone walls visible from virtually every point on the surrounding battlefield. It had stood for centuries, rebuilt after earlier destructions, a monument to endurance that now found itself wedged between the calculations of modern armies. Allied commanders had been circling the monastery question for weeks, debating it with the careful, anxious language of men who understood that whatever they decided would be scrutinized far beyond the immediate military context. Freyberg was not interested in the diplomatic complexity. He was interested in the lives of his soldiers. From his vantage, the question was straightforward. If German observers were using the monastery to direct artillery fire, then every assault launched without removing that advantage was an assault with a hand tied behind its back. He demanded clarity, and he demanded it before a single New Zealander or Indian soldier was ordered to climb. The intelligence available was, by any honest assessment, genuinely ambiguous. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed the monastery surrounded by German positions, gun emplacements, supply routes, defensive works threading right up to the walls. What the photographs could not show, with the resolution available at the time, was what was happening inside those walls. Reports from soldiers on the ground spoke of fire that seemed too precisely directed to originate anywhere but the high ground the monastery occupied. Artillery rounds arrived with a consistency that suggested systematic observation, the kind of watching and calculating that required a high vantage point and good eyes. But observation and inference are not the same as confirmation, and the Allied High Command knew it. The monastery, officially declared off-limits to German military use under agreements between the Vatican and Berlin, was supposed to be neutral. Whether that neutrality was being respected was a question nobody could answer with certainty. Freyberg pressed upward through the chain of command with a persistence that made the question impossible to shelve. He made his position plain to General Mark Clark and to the broader Allied hierarchy. He could not in conscience commit his corps to another assault modelled on the bloody failures that had preceded him unless the monastery's status was resolved. Clark was privately skeptical about the military necessity of destroying the building. He worried about the propaganda damage, about the image of Allied forces reducing one of Western civilization's great sacred sites to rubble. He was not wrong to worry. The consequences he anticipated would in fact arrive, carried on the front pages of newspapers across the world. But Freyberg's argument, whatever its ultimate merits, carried a weight that was difficult to simply dismiss, the weight of command responsibility, of a general who had already watched too many men die for insufficient gains. The aerial reconnaissance missions continued, producing more photographs, more analysis, more inconclusive debate. Intelligence officers studied the images and produced assessments that depended heavily on interpretation. One officer's conclusive evidence of enemy activity was another officer's ambiguous shadow. The monastery's walls were thick enough, its windows narrow enough, and the aerial photography of the era imprecise enough that the images served both sides of the argument equally well. What was clear, absolutely and undeniably clear, was that the mountain itself, the ridges and slopes and rock formations surrounding the abbey, was defended with every skill and resource that German engineering and military professionalism could bring to bear. The paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had turned the entire massif into an interlocking system of fire positions. Whether the monastery itself was part of that system or simply close to it was where certainty dissolved. The conversation eventually climbed to the level of General Harold Alexander, commanding the 15th Army Group. Alexander occupied a peculiar position in the Allied command structure, politically skilled, personally careful, a man who managed strong-willed subordinates through suggestion and consensus rather than direct confrontation. He listened to Freyberg's argument. He heard Clark's reservations. He weighed the intelligence, such as it was, and the pressure from below, which was real and mounting. Alexander's decision, when it came, was to authorize the bombing. He framed it in terms that reflected the ambiguity of the intelligence, not a declaration that the monastery was surely being used as a military position, but an acknowledgement that the doubt itself, in the context of what another failed assault would cost, was sufficient grounds. It was a decision made in the particular moral fog of prolonged attritional warfare, where the clear choices had long since been exhausted. The orders moved through the command structure, with the finality that military decisions acquire once the authority above has spoken. Freyberg had what he needed, or at least what he had demanded. Clark, having registered his objections through the appropriate channels, fell into line. Leaflets were prepared and dropped over the monastery and surrounding areas in the days before the raid, warning civilians and urging evacuation. The gesture was genuine, though its practical effect depended entirely on whether anyone receiving the warnings had both the ability and the time to act on them. The Italian winter and the German military presence surrounding the peak made evacuation a complicated matter. Some people did leave. Whether all who might have left were able to do so remains a question the historical record cannot answer with comfort. The targeting process itself carried the mechanical precision of industrial air power applied to a problem that had no mechanical solution. Planners calculated approach routes, bomb loads, the weight of ordnance required to damage walls of the thickness the monastery possessed. The operation would involve formations of heavy bombers, a commitment of air resources at a scale that reflected how seriously the Allied command had come to view the Cassino deadlock. It was not a surgical strike in any meaningful sense. The technology of the era did not permit surgical strikes against a mountaintop target with walls that had been built to last centuries. It was an act of massive force, applied with the hope that mass would accomplish what precision could not. The decision had been made. The plains were being prepared. The mountain waited, as it had waited for every army that had ever approached it, with the patience that only stone and elevation can maintain. What nobody in the Allied command fully accounted for, what perhaps could not have been fully accounted for without the hindsight that only catastrophe provides, was the specific quality of the soldiers waiting on the mountain's other side. The German paratroopers defending Cassino were not ordinary infantry who might break under the shock of an aerial bombardment of that magnitude. They were among the most capable and resilient soldiers Germany had produced, men who had survived Crete, who had fought across multiple theatres, who had been taught by experience to adapt and to endure. When the order came to bomb the monastery, Allied planners assumed that destruction would create disadvantage for the defenders. They did not adequately reckon with the possibility that for soldiers of this quality, rubble might be a more defensible substance than standing walls. That miscalculation would carry a price measured in lives. But on the eve of the 15th of February 1944, the bombers were already aloft. The decision was made and irreversible, and the mountain's oldest building was about to meet the newest and most destructive tools that the 20th century had assembled for the purpose of breaking things that were meant to last forever. The dawn of the 15th of February 1944 broke cold and clear over the Cassino Valley. For weeks, the debate had raged in tents and headquarters across the Allied command structure. Should they bomb the monastery? Could they bomb it? The question had consumed military planners, intelligence officers, and commanders wrestling with competing imperatives. The need to break a deadlock that had cost thousands of lives, and the weight of destroying one of Christendom's most sacred structures. General Bernard Freyberg, commanding the New Zealand forces tasked with the assault, had demanded clarity before committing his troops to another frontal attack. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed suspicious activity around the monastery's perimeter, though whether German soldiers actually occupied the building itself remained unclear. The photographs were inconclusive, the arguments circular, but the pressure to act mounted daily. A decision had to be made, and in the cold calculus of military necessity, the bombing was authorized. By mid-morning, the sky above Monte Cassino filled with the sound of engines. American bombers, flying fortresses and Mitchells, arrived in waves from airfields to the south, their squadrons comprising more than 250 tons of ordnance. The pilots had orders that were simple and absolute: level the monastery. It was a direct, unconcealed operation, conducted in daylight with witnesses across the entire valley watching as the bombers made their runs. There was no pretense of precision strikes or limited targeting. The intention was total destruction, and within hours, that intention became reality. Wave after wave of bombers released their loads. High explosive shells mixed with fragmentation bombs rained down on the summit where the Benedictine Abbey stood serene against the winter sky. The building that had endured for 14 centuries, since the 6th century when Saint Benedict himself had established the monastery, was about to be erased from existence in an afternoon. The monastery at Monte Cassino was not merely a military structure or a strategic asset. It was a repository of medieval manuscripts, religious art, and architectural achievement that represented over 1,000 years of Christian continuity. Monks had lived within those walls through invasions, plagues, earthquakes, and wars. The abbey had been rebuilt multiple times across the centuries, each reconstruction a proof of persistence and faith. Yet on this day in February, none of that mattered. The building disappeared under the assault of modern weaponry. The rubble cascaded down the mountainside in great clouds of dust and stone. What remained was not a recognizable structure, but a chaotic jumble of concrete, brick, and shattered stones scattered across the summit. The blast waves could be felt kilometers away in the valley below. Soldiers watching from their positions felt the tremors beneath their feet. The sky itself seemed to darken with the dust and smoke rising from the peak. The destruction was comprehensive and irreversible. Where the abbey had commanded the summit with its stone walls and bell tower, now only ruins remained. The strategic calculation, however, was about to prove fatally flawed. General Freyberg and the planners around him had believed that destroying the monastery would eliminate German observation posts that commanded the approaches to the peak and the valley beyond. They reasoned that German paratroopers and infantry had been using the structure as a fortress, that reinforced positions were nestled within its walls, and that bombing would remove this advantage. Some intelligence suggested that the Germans had already mined the monastery for destruction as a precautionary measure. The bombing, so the logic went, would deny the enemy this strong point and make the assault on the mountain feasible. But logic and military reality often diverge with brutal consequences. Within hours of the bombing's conclusion, German paratroopers moved up the mountain. Where once there had been walls and enclosed spaces, now there was rubble, tons of it, scattered across the summit and down the slopes. The paratroopers, hardened combat veterans and engineers, looked at the destruction and saw not a vulnerability, but an opportunity. Rubble, they quickly understood, was an excellent defensive material. The fragmented concrete and stone provided natural concealment and fortification that required far less work than constructing new defensive positions from scratch. Machine gun positions could be established among the ruins, with clear fields of fire across the exposed slopes below. Mortar positions could be dug into the rubble with overhead cover. Anti-tank obstacles could be improvised from the concrete fragments. What the bombing had intended to eliminate, a German strongpoint, had instead been transformed into something potentially more formidable. The German command grasped immediately what had happened. Instead of being forced to abandon the summit, they could now defend it more effectively, with less conventional construction and fewer personnel. The medieval monastery, for all its stone and walls, had actually been less useful as a defensive position than the chaotic rubble that replaced it. A structured building created vulnerabilities, windows through which grenades could be thrown, rooms that could be isolated and cleared, walls that could be breached by explosives. Rubble offered none of these liabilities. It was formless, multidimensional, and could be adapted to the specific needs of defense. German engineers worked methodically to establish strongpoints throughout the debris field, connecting positions with communication trenches and establishing overlapping fields of fire. The paratroopers settled into these new positions with grim satisfaction. The Allies had just handed them a better fortress than the one that had been there before. The international reaction to the bombing was swift and severe. News of the monastery's destruction spread across the world within hours. The Vatican was informed, and though Pope Pius XII made no public condemnation, the symbolic weight was enormous. In the Allied nations, newspapers carried photographs of the rubble. Religious leaders expressed dismay and anger. Military historians and critics questioned whether the bombing had been militarily necessary at all. Some argued that ground assault without preliminary bombing might have succeeded at a lower overall cost. Others questioned whether the monastery had ever been genuinely fortified by the Germans, or whether it had been a false target all along. The debate that would occupy historians for decades was born in that moment, the question of whether military necessity justified the destruction of a cultural monument that had stood for over 1,000 years. What made the bombing particularly tragic was that the answer to the essential question remained ambiguous, even after the destruction was complete. No German soldiers were found sheltering in the monastery itself when it was bombed. The German command had kept the structure intact, precisely because occupying it would have violated their own orders and international custom. The observation posts that intelligence suspected were around the monastery, on the slopes and ridges nearby, remained untouched by the bombing. Rumors of fortifications within the abbey walls were never definitively confirmed. The Allies had destroyed the structure based on reasonable military assumptions that later inquiry suggested were incorrect or at least unproven. The paratroopers who occupied the ruins immediately after the bombing were not displaced from the monastery. They had been fighting on the slopes all along. In the fog of war, a decision had been made on incomplete information, and an irreversible act of destruction had followed. Yet the bombing had consequences beyond the immediate military situation. The psychological impact on the German defenders was significant, but not in the way the Allies had anticipated. Rather than breaking morale or forcing a withdrawal, the destruction seemed to harden resolve. The paratroopers occupying the ruins became more entrenched, more determined to hold what the enemy had just tried to destroy. For the German soldiers, the bombing was confirmation of Allied ruthlessness and a validation of their own struggle. If the enemy was willing to destroy a monastery, then the Germans were fighting against an enemy that recognized no limits. The defenders dug in deeper among the rubble, prepared for the assault they knew would come. The bombing had not weakened their position, it had reinforced it and intensified their commitment to holding the mountain. The destruction of the monastery also had consequences for the New Zealand and Indian forces preparing to assault the mountain in the days immediately following. General Freyberg had authorized the bombing in the hope that it would make his soldiers' task simpler. Instead, the rubble created new obstacles and challenges for the assault troops. The terrain that had once been traversable stone paths and open slopes near the abbey now became a maze of fragmented concrete and irregular obstacles. The broken stone created barriers to movement and turned every approach into a potential killing ground. Machine gun positions in the rubble had better coverage of these new terrain features than they would have had of the original monastery. The bombing had intended to ease the path to victory, but it had done the opposite. The assault troops would face not a simplified objective, but a more complex and deadly tactical situation. For the commanders involved, the bombing represented a turning point in the campaign, though not in the way they had hoped. General Freyberg and his peers would face questions about the decision for the rest of their lives. Some would defend it as militarily justified, given the information available at the time. Others would express regret and acknowledge that the bombing might have been unnecessary. The incident became a cautionary tale about the use of overwhelming force as a substitute for tactical ingenuity. It demonstrated that destroying an objective does not always achieve the desired military effect, and that civilian and cultural considerations carry weight in military decision-making, even when operational necessity seems to demand action. The monastery's destruction on the 15th of February would haunt the campaign and shape how subsequent commanders approached the question of cultural sites in combat zones. The rubble-strewn summit that remained after the bombing stands as a monument to the contradictions of modern warfare. Technology so powerful that it could reduce a millennium-old structure to dust in an afternoon had paradoxically created a stronger defensive position than what had existed before. The monastery was gone, its art and manuscripts lost, its spiritual significance obliterated. Yet the German soldiers who occupied the ruins immediately after the bombing were better positioned to resist than they had been before. This was the grim irony that the campaign had revealed. Overwhelming power did not guarantee operational success, and the application of force often produced unintended consequences that negated its initial purpose. The smoke cleared from the mountain by evening, and the assault on the ruins would begin in darkness just days later. But everyone who served in the Cassino Valley in those days carried with them the knowledge that history had just witnessed the destruction of something irreplaceable. The mountain still did not fall. The ruins of Monte Cassino's abbey smouldered for hours after the bombs fell silent. Where 14 centuries of Benedictine scholarship and prayer had stood, debris fields of limestone and marble now stretched across the summit like the scattered pages of a destroyed manuscript. The monks who had survived, evacuated days before the attack, could only imagine the state of their library, their cells, their chapel. What remained was not the hollow victory American commanders had envisioned, but a catastrophe that would reshape the entire nature of the mountain's defense. Within hours, German paratroopers began climbing the slopes toward the ruins. They moved with purpose, carrying tools and materials, already calculating how to transform sacred destruction into military advantage. The irony was brutal and immediate. The bombing had been authorized with the hope that eliminating the monastery would remove any potential German observation posts or fortified positions sheltering defenders. Intelligence reports remained ambiguous. Photographs were unclear, agents' accounts contradictory, but commanders had ultimately decided that military necessity outweighed cultural preservation. What they failed to fully anticipate was how completely the rubble of a collapsed medieval structure could serve military purposes far better than the intact building ever had. The monastery's thick stone walls, once standing as vertical barriers, now lay in massive chunks and scattered fragments. These pieces became ready-made fortifications that German engineers could position without additional construction. The bomb craters themselves transformed into natural fighting positions. The pulverized limestone created concealment impossible to achieve in open terrain. Within 2 days, German paratroopers had positioned machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and artillery observers among the ruins. General Hasso von Heitzel, commanding the German 1st Parachute Corps defending the sector, understood immediately that the Allied bombing had strengthened rather than weakened his position. His combat engineers went to work with systematic efficiency. They created interlocking fields of fire from positions that offered superior cover. The ruins provided natural defilade, protection from direct observation, while allowing defenders clear sightlines down every approach route. German soldiers constructed sangars, or fortified gun positions, using the largest stone fragments as shields. They established ammunition storage points within the deepest rubble cavities where they would be less vulnerable to counter-bombardment. Communication trenches were dug connecting the various positions, allowing soldiers to move between strong points without exposure. What had been a monastery became a fortress built from its own destruction, and that fortress was more formidable than anything the Allies had anticipated. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. German morale, which might have wavered after seeing their supposed sanctuary bombed, actually hardened. The paratroopers saw proof of their commander's commitment in the destruction itself. They would hold this ground because the Allies had shown they would destroy anything to take it. More importantly, the fact that the bombing had failed to dislodge the defenders proved something to German soldiers. They could endure what the Allies threw at them. The destruction of the abbey became, paradoxically, a recruiting officer for German determination. propaganda officers distributed photographs of the ruins to frontline units, depicting the struggle as one of German perseverance against enemy barbarism. This narrative was not entirely false. The bombing had in fact been monumentally controversial in multiple capitals. In London, the decision to destroy a medieval monastery caused immediate friction within military and political circles. In the Vatican, silence spoke volumes. The Pope, though officially neutral, had long harbored concerns about the monastery's fate. The bombing handed propaganda advantages to Germany that would ripple across Europe and the world. The physical characteristics of the ruins, as a defensive position, deserve particular attention because they explain why subsequent assaults failed so dramatically. Monte Cassino's summit was not a broad plateau, but a relatively confined space crowded with rubble. The largest fragments form natural walls that German engineers exploited without alteration. The pulverized stone had a particular advantage. It held its form without requiring wooden shoring or concrete reinforcement that bombardment might destroy. Soldiers could lie behind fragments that had once been interior walls of the abbey, now providing perfect shoulder-height protection. The monastery's former cellars, partially collapsed but still functional, became shelters from artillery fire and overnight positions. The narrow paths that once connected the monastery's different buildings had become trenches that offered covered movement. Most crucially, the Germans controlled the high ground absolutely. The rubble positions ringed the true summit, and any approaching force had to ascend exposed slopes to reach them. There was no way to advance without being observed, and once observed, Allied soldiers were targets in a killing ground that German machine gunners could control with mathematical precision. The destruction also simplified German logistics in unexpected ways. When the monastery stood intact, German commanders had debated whether troops positioned near it might be exposed to direct assault from soldiers who could use the building's interior passages and rooms for concealment. Those concerns evaporated once the structure became ruins. The open nature of the rubble meant there were no hidden corridors where attackers could infiltrate. Every approach was visible from multiple defensive positions. Supply routes up the mountain, though exposed, could be protected by fire from the summit positions. Ammunition, water, and rations could be stockpiled among the rubble cavities. German engineers calculated that the ruins could sustain a reinforced company indefinitely if supply lines held. This was not theoretical speculation. German units had built entire fortification systems from similarly destroyed towns across Eastern Europe and Italy. They knew from experience how to convert rubble into defense. What the bombing had accomplished was to transform a suspected threat into a concrete disaster. The Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino had stood since around the year 950, rebuilt multiple times through wars and earthquakes, but always preserved as a spiritual center and seat of learning. Its destruction required conscious decision-making by military commanders who understood they were erasing a significant piece of European civilization. The justification was operational, the belief that German defenders were using it for observation. The outcome was that German defenders could now use the ruins for observation and defense combined, with fortifications superior to what any standing building could provide. This was not a failure of strategy so much as a failure of imagination about what comes after bombing. The Allied command had been thinking about the monastery as a single military problem to be solved by a single airstrike. They were not thinking about the cascading effects of their solution. They were not thinking about how rubble could be more dangerous than any occupied building. The international response to the bombing created political complications that rippled upward through every level of Allied command. Religious organizations condemned the attack. Neutral countries issued careful protests. German propaganda, for once, had a genuinely powerful argument. Had the Allies not destroyed a sacred site that German soldiers had supposedly respected? The counter-narrative was that the bombing had been militarily necessary, that intelligence had indicated German use of the monastery, that commanders faced an impossible choice between destroying cultural heritage and risking soldier lives. This argument had logical force, but it faced a basic problem. The bombing had not accomplished its military objective. It had killed monks, it had destroyed an irreplaceable building, and it had left German defenders in an even stronger position. Some Allied officers, particularly British commanders, viewed the decision as a catastrophic error of judgment that had squandered moral authority without gaining tactical advantage. General Harold Alexander, commanding the entire 15th Army Group, bore ultimate responsibility for the decision. Alexander was not indifferent to the cultural significance of what was being destroyed, but he was absolutely committed to breaking through to Rome. He had authorized the bombing based on intelligence assessments that suggested German forces were using the monastery as an observation post. When those assessments proved incorrect, or at least when the bombing failed to produce the hoped-for breakthrough, the decision appeared increasingly questionable. Alexander did not publicly apologize or recant his decision, but his subsequent orders became more careful about targeting cultural sites. The precedent had been set, however. Later in the war, other commanders would face similar dilemmas, and many would reference Monte Cassino as evidence that even bombing ancient structures did not guarantee military success. The actual military impact of the bombing, as opposed to its political impact, was decidedly counterintuitive. The craters created by the heavy bombardment initially appeared to complicate German movement. Engineers had to construct bridges and passages to connect positions separated by bomb craters. However, these same craters provided covered storage for ammunition and supplies that might otherwise have been exposed to artillery counterfire. The physical destruction of the monastery's structure eliminated spaces that Allied soldiers might have used for infiltration. The rubble fields, though chaotic in appearance, could be traversed by defenders who knew the positions because every major fragment served as a landmark and navigation point. Defenders could move through the ruins with purpose. Attackers had to move slowly, carefully, often stopping to scout ahead. This asymmetry of knowledge and confidence favored the garrison absolutely. The days immediately following the bombing represented a critical moment where German commanders made decisions that would shape all subsequent fighting on the mountain. Von Heitzel assigned his best combat engineers and his most experienced NCOs to coordinate the defensive preparations. These soldiers understood fortification not through textbooks, but through repeated experience in North Africa and Russia. They knew how to maximize defensive advantage from limited resources. They knew how to organize fire so that each position supported neighboring positions. They knew how to position machine guns so their field of fire overlapped in ways that made gaps impossible to exploit. The paratroopers they were working with were among the finest infantry soldiers in the German army, disciplined, physically tough, and trained for defensive operations. The combination of excellent soldiers, experienced engineers, and fortifications that had been essentially pre-constructed by the Allies' own bombing created conditions approaching the ideal from a defender's perspective. What emerged over the next 72 hours was a defensive system of remarkable coherence. Roughly 300 to 400 German paratroopers occupied the summit area and the broken terrain approaching it. They had fields of fire that covered every possible approach route. They had contingency positions that allowed them to fall back if a position was overrun, then counterattack from covered positions. They had artillery support from guns positioned lower on the mountain and in the surrounding valleys. They had communication lines that allowed coordinated action across the scattered positions. They had supply lines, though precarious, that kept them provisioned. And they had something intangible but invaluable: the knowledge that they had just survived one of the heaviest bombardments of their lives and emerged stronger rather than weaker. When the next Allied assault came, these soldiers would be confident. They would believe they could hold. This belief, reinforced by concrete fortifications and superior firepower, would prove nearly unshakable through the next 4 months of grinding combat that would consume tens of thousands of additional casualties before Monte Cassino finally fell. The monastery had been destroyed. The fortress that rose from its ruins would prove far more difficult to defeat. The rubble of the monastery still smouldered as dawn broke across the valley on the 16th of February 1944. 1,400 years of sacred architecture had been reduced to ash and broken stone in less than a day. The Allies had hoped the bombing would clear the way for a breakthrough. Instead, it created something far more terrible: a fortress built from the wreckage itself. German engineers moved quickly across the devastated summit, recognizing opportunity where others saw only ruin. The fractured abbey became natural fortification. Every collapsed wall and toppled column transformed into fighting position. Machine gun nests appeared among the rubble. Anti-tank guns were dug in where cloisters had once stood. The monastery, reduced to fragments, had become harder to assault than when it stood intact. General Bernard Freyberg, the commanding officer of the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Corps, understood what he was looking at. He was a veteran of trench warfare from the First World War, a man whose body carried 17 separate wounds from previous campaigns. He knew the mathematics of attrition and the weight of sending young soldiers up exposed slopes against dug-in defenders. The bombing, meant to support his offensive, had instead prepared the Germans for exactly what was coming next. Freyberg had demanded clarity about German intentions before committing his troops to the assault. He had asked for proof that the monastery was fortified, that German spotters were calling down fire from its towers. The reconnaissance reports came back inconclusive, photographs showing German movement in the area, but no definitive proof of occupation. Command had ordered the bombing anyway, a decision made in a room far from the mountain, by men who would not climb its slopes. Now Freyberg had to work with the consequences of that choice. The night of the 16th of February was moonless and cold, the temperature dropping well below freezing across the ridges. The 4th Indian Division would lead the assault, with New Zealand forces in support and British units holding positions on the lower slopes. The Indians were tough soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns across North Africa and now hardened by months of mountain warfare in Italy. They had trained for this moment, studying maps and practicing night attacks in the surrounding hills. But no amount of training could fully prepare human beings for what waited in the darkness above. The artillery barrage that preceded the assault lasted for several hours, shells screaming across the valley and exploding against the rubble-strewn summit. The noise was enormous, echoing off the valley walls and reverberating across the positions below. For the Germans waiting in their fortified positions, the barrage was expected, a signal that the assault was coming, a chance to check their ammunition and steel themselves. As the artillery lifted, the Indian soldiers began their climb. They moved in small groups, weapons held low, trying to preserve noise discipline despite the difficulty of climbing in darkness over loose rock and shattered terrain. The Winter Line's defences didn't end at the monastery summit. They extended down both slopes in a series of interconnected positions that the Germans had spent months perfecting. Barbed wire obstacles had been strung across likely approach routes. Machine gun positions commanded the slopes. Mortar teams waited for the assault to develop, so they could pour fire onto concentrations of attacking troops. The Indians climbed with determination, using the darkness for cover, trying to reach the German positions before they could fully organize their defense. For the first hours, the assault made progress. Indian soldiers infiltrated positions on the lower slopes, engaging German defenders in brief, violent firefights. The Germans fell back incrementally, losing ground as the sheer momentum of the assault pushed them higher. The darkness worked in favor of the attackers initially, preventing German defenders from using the full advantage of their prepared positions. But as the night wore on, German resistance stiffened. Reinforcements arrived from reserve positions further back on the ridge. Counterattacks began, German soldiers moving downslope with grenades and bayonets, looking to drive the Indians back before they could consolidate their gains. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across the slopes, desperate, savage encounters in the darkness where soldiers could barely see their enemies, fighting with rifles, bayonets, grenades, and bare hands. Men screamed and fell, blood mixed with melting snow on the exposed rocks. The New Zealand forces, moving up in support of the Indian assault, found themselves caught in growing chaos. The darkness that had initially protected the attackers now made coordination nearly impossible. Platoons and companies became separated from their units, isolated pockets of soldiers, fighting against German positions they hadn't anticipated. Communications broke down as men moved out of range of their wireless sets, or when equipment was lost in the scramble upslope. Senior officers lost visibility over their forces. Orders couldn't reach forward units in time to adapt to changing circumstances. German commanders, positioned in fortified observation posts, could see the developing attack despite the darkness and direct their reserves to critical points more effectively than the Allies could coordinate their assault. By dawn on the 17th, the assault had stalled. The Indian and New Zealand forces had gained ground, several hundred meters of elevation, some key positions on the lower slopes, but they had failed to reach the monastery ruins or the summit. Worse, they now held positions that were exposed to German counterattack from above. As daylight came, German artillery and mortar fire became devastating. Defenders perched high on the ridges could pour fire down onto the Allied soldiers below with terrible effect. The casualties mounted with each passing hour. Men lay exposed on the slopes, unable to move without drawing fire. The wounded cried out in the cold, waiting for stretcher bearers who had to move carefully to avoid becoming targets themselves. By midday, it became clear that the assault could not advance further, that holding the positions gained would require drawing down reserves, and that any attempt to renew the assault would only add to the mounting casualty toll. Freyberg made the decision to consolidate what he had gained and break off the assault. It was a professional judgment made by a commander with the weight of thousands of soldiers' lives on his conscience. The New Zealand and Indian forces dug in where they stood, holding the forward positions they had seized, but abandoning any hope of a breakthrough. Over the next 2 days, as the exhausted soldiers consolidated and organized their defenses, the true scale of the failure became apparent. The attack had cost thousands of casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, across both divisions. The Germans had held. The monastery ruins remained in German hands. The Winter Line, for all the sacrifice, remained unbroken. What made the defeat particularly bitter was that it seemed preventable. If the bombing had actually cleared the way, if German resistance had crumbled under the impact of such massive ordnance, the assault might have succeeded. Instead, the bombing had created a stronger position and hardened German resolve. The soldiers of the Indian and New Zealand divisions, many of them believing they were being asked to storm a fortified abbey, had found instead that they were climbing toward a fortress that the enemy had had 48 hours to prepare. The monastery's destruction, intended as a gift to the assault, had become a curse. The rubble that should have sheltered advancing soldiers became a weapon against them, shaped by German hands into something harder to take than the standing building had ever been. The wider campaign felt the weight of this failure. Away to the north, at the Anzio beachhead, American forces were being pounded by German counterattacks, pushed back toward the sea, their position becoming increasingly precarious. If Monte Cassino had fallen, if the road to Rome had opened, supplies and reinforcements could have flowed northward to strengthen the Anzio beachhead. That breakthrough might have turned a desperate situation into a breakthrough. Instead, Anzio remained isolated, gasping, dependent on ships bringing supplies across open water. German forces could concentrate against the beachhead, trying to drive the Americans back into the sea, without worrying about enemy forces breaking through from the south. The failure at Monte Cassino rippled across the entire campaign, affecting operations dozens of kilometers away. The German soldiers who held the mountain, seeing the assault repulsed, felt their spirits lifted. They had been holding a position that everyone said was impossible to hold. Command had seemed resigned to losing it. The monastery bombing had momentarily shaken their confidence. The sheer weight and fury of the air attack a demonstration of enemy capabilities that no earthly defender could match. But when the assault came and they repulsed it, when they fought from the rubble and broke the assault, they proved that will and preparation could overcome such disadvantages. Officers wrote reports emphasizing the soldiers' bravery and discipline. Word spread through the German lines that the Allies had been stopped, that the mountain could be held, that perhaps the entire winter line could be held if everyone showed the same determination. Confidence, which had been badly shaken, began to recover. In the valleys and at the forward positions, the exhausted soldiers of the Allied forces registered the weight of this failure. They had given everything, climbed in darkness, fought in hand-to-hand combat, endured artillery fire on exposed slopes, and still the mountain remained German. They dug in and tried to rest, tried to warm themselves in the bitter cold, tried not to think too much about the friends who weren't coming back. Casualties officers worked through the night, trying to account for the missing, sorting out the wounded, recording the names of the dead. Stretcher bearers moved constantly, bringing wounded men down from the slopes to field hospitals that were overwhelmed with the injured. Surgeons worked without rest, amputation saws running constantly, their hands stained with blood that seemed impossible to wash away. The mountain had taken its price, and still it stood unconquered. Still German flags flew from its highest points. Still the vista toward Rome remained blocked by the geometry of rock and snow and German determination. Freiburg knew that another assault would be necessary. The mountain couldn't be left in German hands. The road to Rome couldn't remain blocked by a single fortified position, no matter how costly it would be to take it. He began planning for a renewal of the assault, but not immediately. His soldiers needed rest. Supplies needed to be brought forward. Replacements for the fallen needed to arrive and be integrated into depleted units. Intelligence needed to be gathered about exactly where the Germans had positioned their forces among the rubble. The commanders above Freiburg, Alexander and Clark, and the political leaders they answered to in London and Washington, were pressing for results. Months had passed since the assault began. Thousands of soldiers had fallen. Rome remained behind German lines. The stalemate persisted despite every attempt to break it. Everyone understood that Monte Cassino had to fall, but the mountain seemed to have become something more than a geographic objective, more than a mere piece of terrain. It had become a symbol of the entire campaign's frustration, of the gap between ambition and reality, between what the strategists had planned and what the soldiers could actually accomplish against an enemy that refused to surrender its advantages. The monastery still stood in February 1944, reduced to rubble but not yet possessed by the Allies. On the slopes below, exhausted soldiers carved out shallow defensive positions, knowing that holding ground mattered as much as taking it. The mountain had become a focal point of desperate, grinding attrition, but it was not the only fight consuming Allied resources and resolve. Across the Mediterranean coast, at a place called Anzio, another battle raged with equal ferocity and equal uncertainty. The two fronts were supposed to work in concert. Montgomery's assault on the mountain would crack the winter line, while an amphibious landing behind German defences would collapse it entirely. Instead, by late February 1944, both battles had settled into a nightmare of stalemate and mutual exhaustion that neither side had anticipated or prepared for adequately. General Mark Clark's decision to land at Anzio had promised a bold stroke of operational art. Rather than battering against German defences head-on, American forces would strike behind enemy lines, cutting supply routes and forcing a German withdrawal from the winter line under threat of encirclement. The amphibious assault itself, launched on the 22nd of January 1944, achieved tactical surprise. German commanders had not seriously considered this stretch of coastline a likely invasion site, and the initial beachhead landings met lighter resistance than commanders had feared. Thousands of troops crossed the beaches in the first hours, establishing a bridgehead that grew throughout the day. For a brief moment, it seemed that audacity had achieved what caution never could, a breakthrough that would reshape the entire Italian campaign. But the opportunity window, so narrow and fleeting, began to close almost immediately. General John Lucas, commanding the beachhead forces, chose to consolidate his position and build supplies rather than push inland aggressively within the first critical hours. Whether this was caution or sound judgment remains contested among historians, but the strategic consequence was unambiguous. German forces, under Kesselring's direction, rapidly shifted troops toward Anzio and began constructing a containment ring around the beachhead. Within days, the landing force that was meant to unravel German defences found itself instead besieged and surrounded, pressed against the sea by mounting German counterattacks. The trap had closed not with dramatic finality, but with the slow, suffocating pressure of superior German positioning and reinforcements. By February, Anzio had transformed into a desperate, grinding struggle for survival rather than a launching pad for breakthrough. The beachhead measured only a few kilometers across in most sectors, leaving no room for maneuver and making every position subject to German artillery fire from the surrounding heights. Supply ships arriving at the tiny port came under constant bombardment and air attack. Soldiers crowded into shallow dugouts and improvised shelters, subject to artillery barrages that came without warning and without mercy. The cold February rain turned the beachhead into a waterlogged maze of mud and rubble, while German shells and bombs fell continuously. Men died not in dramatic assaults, but in the grinding, impersonal way that artillery kills, sudden violence punctuating hours of waiting, fear, and exhaustion. The German counteroffensive against Anzio reached its climax in February 1944, just as the second assault on Monte Cassino was failing in the mountains. Kesselring committed nearly 200,000 troops to crushing the beachhead before it could break out, calculating that if Anzio fell, the Monte Cassino position would become nearly impregnable. German attacks from multiple directions pressed the Allies back toward the beaches in places, and the beachhead command radioed urgent requests for reinforcement and supplies. The fighting around Anzio consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement troops, resources that were badly needed elsewhere in the campaign. Engineers worked frantically to expand the small port and improve airfields to deliver supplies by transport aircraft. Every ton of ammunition unloaded at Anzio was a ton that could not be sent to feed the assaults on the Winter Line, and vice versa. This resource competition created a vicious strategic paradox. The two amphibious assaults were meant to reinforce each other. The mountain attack would draw German reserves away from Anzio, while Anzio's threat would force Germans to abandon the Winter Line. Instead, both were failing simultaneously, each demanding larger and larger commitments to prevent complete collapse. General Harold Alexander, commanding the 15th Army Group, found himself in command of two sinking ships, forced to distribute increasingly scarce resources between both battles, while both continued to demand more. Reinforcements that had been earmarked for the pursuit after the Winter Line breakthrough were instead funneled to Anzio's perimeter. Combat divisions meant to rest and regroup were instead committed to new assaults on Monte Cassino, their soldiers already exhausted and depleted. The strategic vision of a coordinated breakthrough was dissolving into tactical desperation on two fronts. Winter weather compounded the misery of the stalemate with indifference and cruelty. Freezing rain and snow fell throughout February on the Italian highlands, turning trenches and foxholes into repositories of cold that seeped into bone and stayed there. Soldiers suffered from trench foot, frostbite, and pneumonia as much as from enemy action. The roads from the coast became mud-choked passages where trucks and jeeps bogged down, slowing the already inadequate supply movement to the front lines. Ammunition arrived late or not at all. Rations came in small quantities, often cold and often damaged by exposure. Medical supplies were rationed, forcing medics to make agonizing choices about which wounded could receive treatment and which could not. The mountain itself, always difficult, became nearly impassable. Soldiers had to climb exposed slopes where their breath froze in the air and their fingers lost feeling inside their gloves. The soldiers themselves were becoming a wasting asset. The American divisions that had stormed ashore at Anzio were no longer first-rate combat formations by February. They were hollowed-out remnants of companies commanded by sergeants, battalions led by captains, because all the officers were dead or wounded. The same erosion was occurring on Monte Cassino, where the assaults had failed not from lack of courage, but from lack of numbers and reserves. The New Zealand and Indian divisions, brought in as fresh troops meant to break the deadlock, were bleeding away in the rubble and snow just as rapidly as the Americans before them. Infantry losses meant the loss of the most experienced soldiers, the men who understood how to move through fire and find cover. Replacement soldiers, often barely trained, took their places in the line and were frequently killed within days of arrival. The cumulative effect was an army that was gradually losing its ability to fight at all. German commanders looked at the situation with grim satisfaction. Kesselring had achieved something rare in modern warfare. He was fighting two battles simultaneously and forcing his enemies to fight both while dividing their resources between them. German casualties were also mounting, and German divisions were being stretched thin across multiple fronts, but the mathematics favored the defender. Germans did not need to attack. They could defend and trade space for time. As long as the beachhead remained contained and Monte Cassino remained unconquered, German forces could maintain their essential position and continue to control the road to Rome. Supply lines, though vulnerable to air attack, stretched behind German lines with relative security. German commanders could rotate units out of the line for rest, something Allied commanders could no longer afford to do. The initiative, tactically speaking, still belonged to the Allies, but strategically, the Germans were winning through attrition. The political pressure mounting on Allied leadership was almost as severe as the pressure on the front lines. London and Washington wanted the Italian campaign to deliver. The war in the Pacific demanded resources as well, and military planners were increasingly focused on the cross-channel invasion of France, scheduled for June 1944. Every soldier, ship, and supply unit tied up in Italy was unavailable for Normandy. Prime Minister Churchill had envisioned the Italian campaign as a swift, decisive operation that would knock Mussolini out of the war and open a southern route into Europe. Instead, it was becoming a drain that had no end in sight. Newspaper headlines in America and Britain began to reflect a growing sense of disappointment and uncertainty. Military newspapers circulating to troops acknowledged the stalemate without quite admitting the failure of planning. Officers received quiet pressure to break through, to achieve results, to justify the mounting cost in lives and material. General Alexander responded to this pressure by attempting to coordinate a new offensive that would combine fresh assaults on both fronts simultaneously. If he could break through at Monte Cassino, while simultaneously breaking out from Anzio, perhaps the two forces could link up and collapse the entire German position. The plan required timing, coordination, and fresh troops, resources that were increasingly difficult to assemble. The Anzio forces would need to break out of their confinement and drive inland to meet the forces coming north from the beachhead. The Monte Cassino assault would need to achieve what 3 previous assaults had failed to achieve. All of this would require renewed commitment of men and material at precisely the moment when both were becoming scarcer. Supply officers worked around the clock to accumulate ammunition and provisions for the new attempt. Every spare truck, every available ship, every transport aircraft was pressed into service to move supplies forward. The ports at Naples and Messina worked continuously, loading cargo and sending it north. At Anzio, engineers expanded the small beachhead port with desperate urgency, installing new unloading equipment and improving storage facilities. On the mountain approaches, supply parties struggled through snow and mud to position ammunition for the assault. Field hospitals prepared for the expected wave of wounded, stockpiling blood and medical supplies in anticipation of the casualties that would come. The entire machinery of war cranked forward with mechanical determination, sustained by hope that this time the attack would succeed where others had failed. Yet beneath the coordination and planning, beneath the tactical preparations and supply movements, lay a deeper reality that no amount of determination could overcome. The stalemate existed not because of poor planning or insufficient effort, but because German defensive positions were genuinely strong, and German soldiers were defending them with genuine competence. The terrain itself favored the defense at both Anzio and Monte Cassino. The weather made movement difficult and vision poor, advantages that belonged to the soldiers in established positions. The casualty rates on both sides were rising, but the overall situation was not shifting. The beachhead remained trapped. The mountain remained unconquered. The winter line held. As February turned toward March, the stalemate deepened further, wearing down both armies in grinding, impersonal fashion that would not be resolved by audacity or courage alone. The winter that had nearly broken the Allies showed no mercy as March arrived across the Italian mountains. At Monte Cassino, the exhaustion was written in the faces of soldiers and the empty ammunition caches that lined the rear positions. The first and second assaults had failed spectacularly, and the strategic clock was ticking relentlessly. Every day that passed meant German reinforcements could consolidate further north, meant resources were consumed in this grinding contest instead of being preserved for the greater operations taking shape across the Mediterranean. The beachhead at Anzio, meant to be a springboard for rapid breakthrough, had instead become a hemorrhaging wound demanding constant supply and reinforcement. Yet the winter line remained intact, blocking the path to Rome, and the monastery ruins still crowned the summit, with German defenders dug in among the rubble, like insects in a stone hive. Command had to find a new approach, one that would not throw soldiers into the same meat grinder that had failed twice before. The answer came from a shift in tactical thinking and the arrival of soldiers uniquely suited to the terrain they would inherit. The planning for the third assault began with a fundamental reassessment of what had gone wrong. The previous attacks had concentrated on direct approaches to the summit, forcing men to climb exposed slopes, while German machine guns swept the open ground with methodical precision. The paratroopers defending the monastery ruins had learned to concentrate their firepower on these obvious routes, creating zones of such deadly intensity that only isolated groups could survive passage. American and French commanders studying the maps and the geography realized that the key lay not in frontal assault, but in infiltration and turning movements. The ridgelines that extended from the main peak toward the south and west offered concealed approaches, harder climbing but less defended. If forces could be inserted into these positions and hold them long enough for reserves to flow through, the German defenders would find themselves outflanked and forced to abandon the summit or face encirclement. This was warfare of patience and geography rather than brute force, a recognition that the mountain itself could be an ally if one read its contours correctly. The forces chosen for this assault reflected the changing composition of the Allied armies in Italy. American forces would maintain pressure in the valley and provide direct support, but the spearhead would be French and Moroccan troops, soldiers whose training and experience made them ideal for mountain operations in harsh conditions. The French expeditionary force had arrived in Italy, seeking to restore France's military presence and national honor after years of occupation and defeat at home. Within their formations marched soldiers from across the French Empire, including units from Morocco that had been fighting through North Africa and now up through Sicily and into mainland Italy. These Moroccan troops were hardy, experienced in mountain terrain similar to the Atlas ranges of their homeland, and motivated by a combination of military discipline and the complex legacy of colonial service. They moved through mountains with an efficiency that came from generations of adaptation to rough terrain. Their commanders understood how to read slopes, how to move men silently through broken ground, and how to maintain cohesion when visibility dropped to mere meters, and the only guidance was the shape of the hillside itself. The operation that began in mid-March represented a new philosophy in the assault on Monte Cassino. Rather than launching a single massive frontal wave, the plan called for infiltration groups to move into position during darkness, establishing themselves in the ridgeline positions under cover of night, while German attention was diverted by diversionary attacks in other sectors. French and Moroccan soldiers, moving in small groups and using terrain mastery honed through months of mountain warfare, would climb toward objectives that had previously been lightly defended because they seemed too difficult to be viable approach routes. The sheer audacity of the plan lay in its rejection of conventional wisdom about where attacks should come from. German commanders, conditioned by the previous failures, expected the next assault to resemble the ones that had come before, concentrated and obvious. What they would instead face was an infiltration that turned the supposed advantages of the mountain into a disadvantage if one could move through them faster and more skillfully than the defenders expected. The initial phase of the assault saw French and Moroccan forces begin their climb in the darkness before dawn on the 15th of March. The men moved in file, ropes connecting them in some cases, guides moving from memory and terrain familiarity rather than written instructions that could be lost or captured. The cold bit at them with renewed intensity, the kind of grinding cold that sapped strength and dulled thought long before the fighting began. But the darkness was their ally, and the noise of their movement was swallowed by the greater rumble of artillery fire that American guns were pouring onto German positions as diversionary bombardment. Higher and higher the infiltration columns climbed, passing through sectors where German defenders were either absent or so focused on the expected approach routes that they missed the shadow figures moving through the blackness. Some groups encountered opposition, brief firefights in the darkness that erupted without warning and subsided just as quickly. The mountain, in darkness, belonged to whoever could move through it with confidence and purpose. As dawn broke across the ridges, and Moroccan soldiers found themselves entrenched in positions they had seized in darkness, the German command began to understand that something different was happening. Strong points that should have been anchoring the defensive line had been bypassed or were now under fire from unexpected directions. German paratroopers began to shift forces to contain the infiltrators, moving away from the summit to plug gaps that had suddenly opened in the defensive scheme. This was exactly what the Allied plan had intended: force the Germans to disperse their strength, commit reserves to containing the infiltration, and erode the concentrated defense of the monastery ruins itself. The Moroccan and French soldiers, though now exposed in daylight, held their ground with stubborn aggression, using the terrain to create mutually supporting positions that were difficult to assault head-on. They had trained for this, and their discipline in those early hours, when shock and confusion reigned on both sides, kept them from being overwhelmed in the counterattacks that German paratroopers launched with typical ferocity. The fighting through the middle days of the assault combined grinding aggression with moments of chaos that neither side fully controlled. Moroccan troops pushed higher on the ridges, gaining meter by meter of elevation that cost them casualties, but also cost the German soldiers pulled from elsewhere to contain them. French units supported the Moroccan advance and launched attacks of their own on adjacent positions, trying to broaden the penetration and keep German reserves scattered across the front rather than concentrated for a decisive counterattack. Artillery fire from both sides intensified, creating a world of constant explosive violence that made supply difficult and reinforcement of forward positions a task requiring immense courage. Ammunition bearers climbed toward the firing line, carrying rounds on their shoulders through shells falling with increasing density as the German artillery command sought to suppress the American guns supporting the assault. The terrain itself became a weapon, steep enough that any soldier moving uphill moved slowly and exposed, making them targets for defenders positioned even slightly higher. Yet the Moroccan and French soldiers persisted, neither being broken by the losses nor by the German counterattacks that came with waves of reinforcements. Within the first 2 days of the assault, it had become clear that the infiltration strategy was achieving what the frontal assaults had failed to accomplish. It was disrupting the German defensive plan and forcing them to commit reserves in reactions rather than from prepared positions. The monastery ruins, still held by German paratroopers, now found themselves increasingly isolated as the positions supporting their flanks were pushed back or lost entirely. The German command faced a genuine dilemma. They could pour more men into the mountain and attempt to drive the infiltrators off, risking the creation of an exposed salient that could be encircled, or they could consolidate around the abbey ruins and prepare to use them as a final strongpoint while falling back on reserves elsewhere. The tactical situation was becoming fluid in a way it had not been before, and for the first time since the assault began in January, German options were contracting rather than expanding. By the 6th of March, the Moroccan and French forces had secured positions on the ridges that gave them observation of the monastery and control of several of the approaches toward the summit. They had failed, like the forces before them, to drive directly through to the peak or to secure it entirely. German paratroopers, instead of being dislodged, had merely consolidated their grip on the monastery ruins and the immediate vicinity, recognizing that the peak itself was becoming increasingly difficult to defend, but that the abbey remained the critical strongpoint. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the geometry of the battle. Where previously German defenders had maintained a relatively compact defensive perimeter that could be reinforced from interior lines, they now faced threats from multiple directions simultaneously, and any reinforcement had to travel longer routes under constant Allied fire. The time was approaching when the position would become untenable, not from a direct assault on the summit, but from the slow collapse of the defensive structure around it. The third assault's failure to capture the monastery, however, must be understood not as a final defeat, but as the setup for what would come next. The Moroccan and French soldiers, through their infiltration and their willingness to hold positions in the frozen heights despite constant German counterattacks, had fractured something essential in the German defense. They had proven that the mountain could be approached from directions the defenders had not fully prepared, that the terrain favored not just the man in the defensive position, but also the man who could read the ground and move through it with skill and aggression. The casualties continued to mount. Every meter of elevation gained cost blood and ice-burned fingers, and the shattered nerves of men who had been fighting under fire longer than anyone should have to. But these casualties were now buying something concrete, the opening of new approach routes that future assaults would be able to exploit. The question facing Allied command was whether they had the reserves and the political will to sustain one more assault, one more throw of the dice, to finish what the mountain itself seemed to be surrendering only in pieces. As the third assault settled into stalemate in the higher elevations, the larger strategic picture continued to press on commanders' minds. The invasion of Normandy remained months away, but would require enormous resources that were currently locked up in the Mediterranean. The beachhead at Anzio remained precarious, and every fresh division committed to Monte Cassino was a division not available to reinforce the beach or exploit a breakthrough if one could be achieved. German forces, though pushed back and suffering casualties, remained coherent and functional, withdrawing northward in good order whenever positions became untenable. The winter line had bent, but not broken, and there remained in the German defensive position the capacity to absorb the third assault's gains and fight on. Yet the mathematics of attrition were beginning to favor the Allies despite the terrible costs. German reinforcements were harder to move and harder to supply. German reserves were limited, and every fresh attack was eating away at an enemy strength that could not be indefinitely renewed. The third assault, therefore, must be understood as a bridge toward the conclusion, a battering that pushed the Germans closer to the breaking point without quite delivering the knockout blow that commanders had sought and that soldiers' blood had been purchased to achieve. By March 1944, the mountain had become a monument to human stubbornness. The winter line held, the Anzio beachhead, which was supposed to uncoil behind German defences and render the mountain irrelevant, had instead become a prison, a trapped and hemorrhaging force of nearly 200,000 men pinned to a narrow strip of beach by German counterattacks that nearly drove them back into the sea. The Allies had committed enormous resources to two separate operations that were supposed to work in concert, and instead they were starving each other. Men died on both fronts while supplies were split, while reinforcements were diverted, while the overall strategic momentum that had seemed inevitable just weeks earlier began to feel uncertain, almost fragile. Commanders in London and Washington found themselves asking uncomfortable questions. How long would this take? What if the Germans held? What if neither the mountain fell nor the beachhead expanded? These were not questions that senior commanders wanted to voice, but they hung in staff meetings like an unspoken recognition of failure. The Cassino sector, after weeks of assault by American and French forces and the failed Indian and New Zealand attacks, required new command. Exhaustion had settled into the formations holding the lines. Men had climbed the mountain multiple times in darkness, in rain and snow, only to be driven back. They had dug trenches, held positions under artillery bombardment, and endured the rhythm of attack and retreat that left small unit cohesion fractured and morale dangerously thin. Officers spoke of men whose hands trembled from cold and fatigue, who had to be practically carried up slopes, who stared at orders with the blank expression of soldiers whose minds had begun to retreat, even while their bodies remained in the line. Fresh formations were needed, but more than fresh formations, the assault required a commander whose presence itself could carry weight, whose authority could reinforce will when physical strength alone proved insufficient. That commander would be General Władysław Anders, and his arrival in March 1944 marked a turning point, not in the battle itself, but in the psychological calculus of the campaign. General Anders was not simply another corps commander. He carried within him the compressed weight of a nation that had been fractured and occupied, driven underground, and split across exile. He had been captured by Soviet forces in 1939, imprisoned for nearly 2 years, and released only after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. His journey had taken him through Middle Eastern training camps, through North Africa, and finally to Italy, with his Polish Second Corps, a fighting force of men who were not simply soldiers, but carriers of national memory and national grievance. These were men whose families remained under occupation, whose homeland existed in their minds as maps they could not return to and conversations they conducted in exile. When they climbed toward Monte Cassino, they climbed as Poles fighting not just for position on a mountain, but for the possibility that their nation might one day be free to reclaim itself. This dimension of the Polish Corps was not a military asset that could be measured in field strength reports, but it was real. It was visible in the way these men moved, in the intensity with which they accepted orders, in the personal investment they brought to objectives that seemed abstract to soldiers from other nations. Anders himself embodied this complicated legacy. As a commander, he was rigorous and uncompromising, shaped by the military traditions of pre-war Poland and hardened by years of captivity and survival. He understood the difference between military necessity and sentimentality, but he also understood the symbolic weight of what he was being asked to do. When he arrived at the Cassino sector, he inherited a mountain that had already taken thousands of casualties, a failure that had accumulated across multiple assaults, and German positions that had been reinforced and reinforced again. He was handed an objective that had somehow become both militarily essential and emotionally charged, in ways that extended far beyond the Italian campaign itself. Breaking through at Cassino was no longer simply about opening the road to Rome or linking with Anzio. It had become tied, in the minds of commanders and politicians, to demonstrating that the Allies could achieve breakthrough, that attrition had an end point, that momentum could be recovered even from months of stalemate. The pressures converging on the campaign by mid-March were becoming almost unbearable. In London, strategic planners were keenly aware that the date of the Normandy invasion was approaching. The cross-channel operation, codenamed Overlord, that would be the true center of gravity for the entire war. Resources that might have been allocated indefinitely to Italy were being hoarded for the French coast. Aircraft, landing craft, personnel replacements, and ammunition were all being carefully inventoried for their role in the future invasion. Italy had become, in strategic terms, a secondary theatre, and yet it could not simply be abandoned or left static. The Germans held it, and leaving German forces unoccupied in the Mediterranean, while the Allies mounted an amphibious assault on northern Europe, would be strategically reckless. So Italy had to be prosecuted, but efficiently, quickly, without consuming resources that were needed elsewhere. This was the calculation that political and military leadership in London and Washington were trying to execute, and it hung over every decision being made at Cassino. Field Marshal Alexander, commanding the 15th Army Group, and General Mark Clark of the 5th Army were acutely aware of these constraints. They understood that their campaign had a window, perhaps weeks, perhaps only days, before the strategic logic of the entire Mediterranean theatre would shift decisively toward holding what had been gained rather than pushing for more. They understood that breakthrough at Cassino was not going to be simple or clean, that it would require a final massive push by well-positioned and fresh forces. When General Anders arrived to take command of the Cassino sector, he was being handed not just a tactical problem, but a strategic deadline that was not being explicitly discussed, because to speak it aloud would be to admit that the entire campaign was being compressed into an increasingly tight time frame. Anders set about assessing the situation with the methodical precision of a commander accustomed to dealing with uncertainty. He visited positions, he spoke with company commanders and battalion leaders, he examined maps and studied the patterns of attack and retreat that had characterized the previous assaults. He understood that the mountain was not going to surrender to another frontal assault conducted in the same way as the earlier attempts. He was acutely conscious of the losses already accumulated. The New Zealand and Indian formations had already paid enormous prices, and throwing fresh troops into the same patterns of failure would be profligacy of the worst kind. What was required was different, not just in execution, but in conceptual approach. The breakthrough needed to come not from pushing harder in the same direction, but from finding a new direction, from leveraging the particular skills and perspectives of the forces now under his command. The Polish Second Corps brought particular qualities to the Cassino sector. These were men trained in mountain operations, soldiers who had operated in North Africa and understood desert and Mediterranean conditions. They brought also a level of unit cohesion and personal motivation that could not be replicated simply through good leadership. They had something to prove, not just militarily, but politically, historically, personally. When they were ordered to attack Monte Cassino, it was not merely an order from above, but an alignment of command objective with unit motivation that created a psychological intensity different from earlier assaults. Anders understood this and worked to channel it, to shape it into tactical and operational focus, rather than allowing it to dissipate into mere emotional investment without corresponding military effect. The political pressure intensifying around the campaign was becoming difficult to ignore. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were growing impatient. Reports arriving from the Mediterranean described a campaign that seemed to be grinding to a halt, that was consuming enormous resources without delivering corresponding results. The news of the monastery bombing had spread globally, and while military commanders could justify it as a tactical decision to remove a potential observation post, the international reaction combined religious concern, strategic skepticism, and questions about whether the operation was being prosecuted efficiently or had become bogged down in wasteful attrition. The bombing had not even broken through. German forces had immediately occupied the ruins and converted them into stronger fortifications. This created a narrative problem that complicated the political support the campaign enjoyed, particularly in Catholic nations and among Catholic populations in the United States. London was sending similar signals. Churchill and the British War Office wanted the Italian campaign to move, to produce results, to demonstrate that Mediterranean operations were worthy of continued strategic investment even as resources were being diverted toward overlord. The Prime Minister himself was invested in the campaign's success, having championed operations in the Mediterranean against American strategic preferences. The pressure from above, combined with the stalemate in the field, to create a sense that something had to give, that another failed assault would be difficult to justify politically, that the next attempt at breakthrough had to succeed, or questions would be asked about the entire conduct of the campaign. For General Anders and his officers, this pressure was present but not paralyzing. What they focused on was the mountain itself, the positions to be taken, the tactical and operational arrangements required to achieve breakthrough. Anders began to develop plans for a coordinated assault that would combine Polish pressure from new angles with continued efforts by American and French formations to fix German forces and prevent reinforcement. He was working to achieve what had eluded the earlier commanders, not a massed frontal assault that would rely on willpower and numbers to overcome prepared defenses, but a more sophisticated combination of maneuver, timing, and concentration that would exploit German weakness and Polish strengths. The planning was meticulous because everyone understood that resources for another failure were not available, that this assault would have to be different, and that everything depended on execution. As March drew toward April, the sector around Cassino took on a different character. Fresh Polish units were being positioned, supplies were being concentrated, reconnaissance missions were probing German defenses, searching for weakness and opportunity. The mountain seemed to wait, indifferent to human desire or political pressure, as commanders below and politicians above converged on the understanding that the breakthrough had to come soon and would have to come through an assault that was being planned with unprecedented detail and preparation. The campaign that had seemed like it would be a swift breakthrough and a clean dash to Rome had become instead a grinding test of will and endurance, where success was being pursued not through rapid maneuver, but through careful concentration of force, meticulous planning, and the particular qualities that General Anders and the Polish Second Corps could bring to the breaking of a stalemate that had begun to seem almost permanent. By the middle of May 1944, the mountain had claimed more than 4 months of fighting, and the Allies were running out of time. In the broader European theatre, preparations for the Normandy landings were entering their final, secretive phase. Every division, every piece of artillery, every trained soldier was becoming currency in a competition between theatres. The Germans knew this pressure existed. They also knew that if Monte Cassino could be held a little longer, if the Winter Line could absorb the Allies in a grinding stalemate, perhaps resources meant for France might be diverted, or the invasion itself delayed. The mountain had become more than a strategic position. It had become a test of whether the Allies could actually break through a determined defense, or whether modern warfare had evolved into pure attrition with no clear breakthrough possible. General Władysław Anders brought something different to the Cassino sector when he assumed command of the Polish corps. His soldiers were not fresh from home. They were remnants of an army that had fought in 1939, been scattered by invasion, and many had endured Soviet captivity before being released to fight under British command. Polish troops had served in North Africa, fought in Burma, and now stood at the base of this limestone mountain with a personal intensity that transcended the standard calculations of military command. For many of these men, Poland itself was in enemy hands, occupied by Nazi Germany while they served thousands of kilometers away. Monte Cassino offered something concrete, a chance to strike at the power that had shattered their nation, to demonstrate Polish courage and capability on a major battlefield. This was not abstract strategy. This was survival of a national spirit through the act of fighting. Anders surveyed the ground and the accumulated lessons of 3 failed assaults. He rejected the frontal hammer blows that had characterized the American, French, and Indian efforts. Instead, he ordered preparation for a more sophisticated approach, a broad frontal engagement designed to pin German defenders in place, while secondary forces executed encircling movements through the high ground on either flank. The plan required better reconnaissance, more careful coordination between units, and precise timing, but it acknowledged the brutal reality that no single attack on the mountain's face would break German resistance. The monastery ruins would remain the psychological anchor and the hardest point to capture. But Anders understood that the Winter Line's collapse would not require holding the ruins themselves. It would require making the entire German position untenable by threatening withdrawal routes and reinforcement paths. Polish engineers and reconnaissance troops spent days mapping approach routes through rocky terrain where every meter of cover mattered. German defenders on the mountain numbered roughly 3,000 men, primarily Fallschirmjäger, paratroops of the 1st Parachute Corps, reinforced with grenadiers and anti-tank teams. They were exhausted by months of holding ground, worn down by repeated assaults, but their discipline remained intact. They occupied positions that had been refined through weeks of trial and error, positions that had already repelled the New Zealand Division, the Indian Division, and American forces. The German commander on the mountain understood that reinforcement was unlikely. Berlin had committed the forces assigned and no more. Every man defending the peak knew he was expected to hold until ordered to withdraw, and that withdrawal order had not come. The rubble of the monastery itself had been transformed into a fortress. Concrete positions had been built into the ruins. Machine guns commanded approach routes. Anti-tank guns protected against armor attempting to approach from the valley floor. The attack began on the evening of the 11th of May 1944, with artillery preparation on a scale that attempted to suppress German defensive fire. British, American, and Canadian guns opened up across the valley, pouring shells into German positions for hours. The bombardment was designed not only to kill and wound, but also to keep German defenders in shelter, while Polish and other Allied units moved into assault positions during darkness. Unlike the earlier attacks, which had often been launched in daylight from hasty preparations, the Polish assault was conducted with methodical timing, units moving into position while darkness provided concealment, preparing to move upward as dawn approached. French colonial forces and other divisions aligned alongside the Poles, ready to attack different sectors of the Winter Line simultaneously. The entire valley south of the mountain seemed to vibrate with the roar of artillery, a sound so pervasive that it created its own psychological atmosphere, the sensation that something enormous was about to be launched. As dawn broke on the 12th of May, Polish units began their climb. Unlike previous assaults that had focused on the monastery ruins themselves, Polish forces attacked the ridgelines and approaches that fed into the mountain's summit. Soldiers moved upward in small groups, using the broken terrain for cover, exploiting every shadow and rocky outcrop. German defenders, positioned higher and looking down, possessed the inherent advantage of the defender. Gravity and observation both worked against the attacker. But the Polish assault possessed something previous attacks had lacked: adequate reserves committed to maintain pressure and exploit any breakthrough. As German defenders concentrated fire on one Polish unit, other units were already moving laterally to attack from unexpected angles. The coordinated assault across multiple sectors of the Winter Line meant that German commanders could not simply reinforce Cassino's defenders without weakening positions elsewhere, and those other positions were also under heavy attack. The fighting on the 12th and 13th of May was brutal and intimate. Soldiers engaged in hand-to-hand combat on narrow ridges where casualties accumulated in clusters rather than being spread across broad battlefields. Polish units advanced meter by meter, taking casualties and continuing forward. German counterattacks attempted to drive Polish forces backward, sometimes succeeding locally before Polish reserves appeared to stabilize the line. The mountain became a chaos of small unit actions, where company commanders made life-and-death decisions about where to commit their remaining men, where German platoon leaders had to calculate whether reinforcements might arrive or whether they were fighting to delay the inevitable. Polish soldiers climbed through the night, using hand signals to coordinate movement when radio communication failed or became too dangerous to use. Some units became intermixed with German forces in the darkness, creating situations where distinguishing friend from enemy required extreme caution. By the morning of the 13th of May, Polish forces had pushed significant elements higher on the mountain. They had established positions that threatened German lines of supply and withdrawal. More importantly, they had done something the previous assaults had not achieved. They maintained their attack despite heavy casualties. German defenders found themselves being slowly compressed upward toward the monastery ruins. The German commander understood that his position was becoming encircled. Units on the flanking ridges were being pushed back. The main defense line was being ground away by Polish determination and superior reserves. By the afternoon of the 13th, with Polish units moving into positions that overlooked the monastery from multiple directions, German commanders began planning for withdrawal. They could no longer hold this position indefinitely. They could no longer expect reinforcement. The decision was made to conduct an orderly retreat northward toward new prepared positions. Polish units reached the ruins of the monastery on the 15th of May 1944. The moment was almost anticlimactic after the intensity of the climbing and the close quarters fighting. Polish soldiers approached the destroyed structure cautiously, clearing positions, discovering that the German defenders had already withdrawn in the preceding hours. Some accounts describe Polish soldiers raising their national flag above the ruins, a symbolic gesture that would be captured in photographs and would carry meaning far beyond the tactical significance of holding a pile of rubble. The monastery had been reduced to broken walls and shattered stone by the bombing raid in February, and German paratroopers had already extracted everything of tactical value. But for the Polish soldiers standing amid those ruins, the mountain itself had finally been conquered. The barrier that had held back the Allies for months was broken. What made the Polish breakthrough decisive, however, was not the mountain itself, but the coordinated assault across the entire Winter Line. As Polish forces pressed the Cassino sector, other Allied units attacked German positions to the north and west. French colonial forces and American units broke through in the Urunci Mountains, threatening to outflank the entire German line. German defenders found themselves being pressed from multiple directions. The The careful balance that Kesselring had maintained, using interior lines to shift reserves where pressure was greatest, was finally overwhelmed by the weight and coordination of the Allied assault. The German commander understood that if he attempted to hold every position, he would lose entire divisions to encirclement. The only rational option was to order a fighting withdrawal northward toward the Gothic Line, the next prepared position further up the Italian peninsula. The breakthrough was not a collapse. It was not a rout in which German forces fled in panic. German units conducted fighting withdrawals, establishing defensive lines long enough to disrupt Allied pursuit, then falling back to the next position. German engineers dynamited bridges and roads behind the retreating forces, creating obstacles that slowed Allied advance. German artillery continued to inflict casualties as the Allies pursued northward, but the strategic collapse had begun. The Winter Line, which Kesselring had believed could hold indefinitely, had been broken by a combination of factors. The sheer weight of Allied artillery, the arrival of reinforcements that German command could not match, the exhaustion of defenders after months of holding ground, and the shift from frontal assaults to coordinated operations that exploited the broader strategic situation. The Poles had planted their flag on the mountain, but it was the entire Allied assault machine that had finally overcome German resistance. By the 16th of May, the road south from Rome was becoming open. German forces were withdrawing in good order, but without the ability to establish a cohesive new defense. The Anzio beachhead, which had been contained and nearly destroyed weeks earlier, was now breaking out as German strength waned. American and British forces from the Anzio beachhead began driving inland and northward, moving toward link-up with forces coming from the south. German units that had been transferred to contain the beachhead were now being pulled away to establish new defensive lines further north. The stalemate had broken, not because one assault was suddenly more brilliant than all the others, but because months of pressure had finally accumulated to a breaking point. Polish courage and sacrifice had been part of that accumulation, but so had the weight of Allied resources, the consistent pressure on multiple fronts, and the simple reality that German forces could not be everywhere at once. The capture of Monte Cassino by Polish forces marked the end of a campaign that had consumed months and thousands of lives to advance a distance that peacetime travel would cover in hours. But it also marked the beginning of the end for German control of central Italy. The Winter Line had broken. German forces would conduct skilled delaying actions across the next 100 kilometers, but they would not establish another cohesive defensive position that could hold against sustained Allied pressure. The Polish flag flying above the monastery ruins represented not the triumph of any single assault, but the cumulative effect of sustained military pressure, exhaustion of defenders, and the slow grinding victory of an army that could replace losses while the enemy could not. On the mountain and in the valleys around it, the nature of modern warfare revealed itself. Not in dramatic breakthroughs or moments of inspired genius, but in the accumulation of effort, sacrifice, and the willingness to absorb losses in pursuit of objectives that seemed almost impossibly distant at the beginning of the campaign. The flag planted atop the monastery ruins by Polish soldiers on the 19th of May, 1944, signified more than the capture of a single fortified position. It marked the moment when German strategy in Italy began to fracture under cumulative pressure. For months, the Winter Line had held because it was a unified defensive system, each position supporting the others through interlocking fields of fire and mutual reinforcement. Monte Cassino was the keystone. Once removed, the entire structure became vulnerable to collapse. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring knew this. His commanders knew this. And now, with Polish flags visible from the valleys below and American artillery finding new ranges across the broken slopes, German officers throughout the sector confronted an uncomfortable calculation. They could not hold everything. The winter line, stretched thin across the width of the Italian peninsula, had already been pushed near its breaking point by months of Allied pressure from multiple directions. The Cassino sector alone had absorbed more than 250,000 soldiers from 6 nations. German reserves, finite and increasingly depleted, could no longer plug every gap. The immediate problem facing Kesselring was geometric. His defensive line extended roughly 110 kilometers from the Tyrrhenian Sea on the west to the Adriatic coast on the east. He had perhaps 400,000 troops spread across these fortifications, facing an Allied force nearly as large and growing stronger by the day. Behind the ruins of Monte Cassino lay the rest of the winter line, positions named on maps and in field orders with clinical precision, yet each one occupied by exhausted men holding increasingly indefensible ground. The Liri Valley, which opened southward from the monastery position, offered straight roads leading toward Rome. German forces could not afford to be encircled from the north by American spearheads driving up from the south, while simultaneously being threatened by breakout forces pressing westward from the Anzio beachhead, now 20 kilometers to their rear. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Kesselring issued the order, withdraw northward to new prepared positions. The operation would be called a fighting retreat, a term that sounds controlled and orderly in military language, but meant something far different to the soldiers executing it. Organized chaos, constant contact with the enemy, and the perpetual necessity of turning to fight before moving again. The German withdrawal from the winter line was orchestrated with characteristically Prussian precision, yet it unfolded amid genuine logistical strain and tactical uncertainty. Engineers had already prepared secondary and tertiary defensive lines stretching northward, fortifications that Kesselring's staff had recognized months earlier would likely be necessary. These positions, however, were not as thoroughly developed as the winter line itself. Concrete bunkers, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles existed in skeletal form across various ridgelines and river crossings, but they required time to complete. Time was something the Germans no longer possessed in abundance. The withdrawal began almost immediately after Polish units consolidated their hold on Cassino. German commanders ordered their men to disengage carefully, pulling back in echelon to maintain contact with Allied forces, while avoiding the catastrophic rout that could occur if discipline collapsed. Supply columns moved northward on narrow mountain roads, clogged with retreating units, damaged vehicles, and wounded soldiers requiring evacuation. The Luftwaffe, now reduced to fewer than 100 serviceable fighters in the Italian theatre, could offer minimal protection against the overwhelming Allied air superiority that now seemed to control the skies by daylight. What made the German withdrawal something other than a simple rout was the tactical skill of engineers and rearguard units who understood their business. Throughout the 1940s, German officers had demonstrated a particular mastery of defensive operations and controlled withdrawal under pressure. This Italian campaign, brutal though it was, gave them ample opportunity to practice these skills. As American and Polish forces pushed northward from Cassino, they encountered deliberate ambushes, improvised blocking positions, and mined roads that slowed their advance and inflicted casualties. German engineers, working under fire, destroyed bridges behind the retreating columns to slow Allied mechanized forces, while leaving routes passable for German troops on foot. These temporary obstacles bought hours and sometimes days, precious time to move supplies and personnel away from the advancing Allies. The German retreat was neither panicked nor precipitous. It was, in the military terminology of the era, a planned disengagement, which meant soldiers were dying to buy time for other soldiers to escape. The Anzio beachhead, throughout this period, remained a secondary theatre in German minds, but a primary concern for Allied commanders. The landing, carried out on the 22nd of January 1944, was meant to cut German supply lines and force them to abandon the Winter Line. Instead, it had become a besieged fortress, penned into a narrow coastal perimeter by German counterattacks that very nearly pushed the Allies back into the sea. By mid-May, the beachhead held roughly 150,000 troops in conditions of constant vulnerability. The breakout from Anzio was supposed to coincide with the breakthrough at Cassino. In theory, German forces would be squeezed between two converging Allied armies and forced to surrender or be destroyed. Reality proved more complicated. German commanders, though facing pressure from the south, managed to maintain enough strength to contain the beachhead. It was not until the Cassino breakthrough appeared imminent that Kesselring authorized the forces facing Anzio to begin their own withdrawal. This decision reflected the strategic reality. With the Winter Line compromised, the Anzio force would be outflanked by the advancing southern armies in any case. Better to withdraw before being trapped. The breakthrough toward Rome itself began in earnest on the 20th of May, as American forces poured through the Liri Valley in pursuit of retreating German columns. General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, authorized an accelerated pursuit despite the usual concerns about overstretching supply lines and exposing flanks. The terrain favored rapid movement, relatively open valley floors where American armored units could maneuver at speeds impossible in the mountain terrain where so much blood had been spilled. German resistance stiffened at river crossings and at certain ridgelines, but these were delaying actions designed to buy time rather than permanent defensive positions. The Germans were executing what military theorists call elastic defense, yielding space to preserve forces. It is an effective strategy when executed by skilled troops against an enemy willing to pursue cautiously. It becomes dangerous when the pursuing force moves aggressively and cuts off retreat routes. American commanders, motivated by the promise of reaching Rome and breaking the stalemate that had plagued the Mediterranean campaign for months, pushed their divisions hard. Tank columns moved at night under moonlight. Infantry units marched in darkness to avoid air attack. Supply trucks raced through valleys, vulnerable to ambush, but essential to maintain the momentum. The meeting of American forces from the south, with reconnaissance elements from Anzio, occurred on the 25th of May, 1944, roughly 70 kilometers south of Rome. The breakthrough was complete. German forces that had defended so fiercely were now in genuine danger of encirclement. Kesselring immediately authorized further withdrawal northward. His forces, though badly battered and significantly reduced in strength, maintained enough cohesion to avoid the complete collapse that might have resulted from less skilled command. German units conducting rearguard actions inflicted enough casualties and imposed enough delays to allow their main forces to cross the Tiber River and establish new positions in the hills north of Rome. The German 14th Army, which had borne the brunt of the fighting at Cassino, was reduced to roughly 90,000 combat troops and was forced to abandon much of its equipment due to transport shortages. Yet it remained a fighting force, capable of further resistance even if no longer capable of holding the Winter Line. General Clark's ambition now focused entirely on Rome. The capital city held enormous symbolic value. first major Axis capital to fall to the Allies, proof that Fortress Europe was vulnerable, a propaganda victory of immeasurable worth. Clark authorized his pursuit columns to bypass German delaying positions and drive directly for the city. On the 31st of May, advanced American reconnaissance elements reported being within striking distance of Rome's outlying defenses. The German garrison in the city numbered perhaps 10,000 troops, mostly support personnel and garrison forces rather than combat divisions. Kesselring made a calculated decision. Rome would be declared an open city. No street-by-street fighting, no urban destruction to match the devastation inflicted on other Mediterranean cities. German forces would withdraw northward, evacuating what equipment they could, leaving the city itself largely intact. This decision reflected both military logic and a certain pragmatism. German forces were too badly damaged to defend a large city against American forces, and the political cost of reducing Rome to rubble was untenable. The final collapse of the Winter Line occurred over the course of 10 days following the Polish capture of Cassino. German forces did not vanish or dissolve into scattered bands. They retreated in organized fashion, trading space for time in a tactical dance that would characterize German operations throughout the remainder of the campaign. Yet the old line was gone, the fortress that had taken nearly 6 months to crack, that had consumed more than 200,000 casualties from a dozen nations, that had seemed nearly impregnable despite the bombing of the monastery and the blood spilled on its slopes. It was broken. Engineers demolished the few remaining bunkers as they fell back. Supplies that could not be transported were destroyed. Wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated were left in the care of monks and local civilians, with formal notification to the Allies regarding their location so that they would receive medical treatment. The professionalism never wavered, even as the strategic position collapsed. What struck observers during those final weeks of May 1944 was how the breakthrough seemed to accelerate almost exponentially once the initial breach appeared. For months, the Allies had pushed and been pushed back, gained a few hundred meters at terrible cost, lost them again to German counterattacks. The tempo of operations had been measured, grinding, an arithmetic of casualties rather than maneuver. Now, suddenly, movement returned to warfare. American divisions covered 20 or 30 kilometers in a single day. German columns clogged the roads northward, vulnerable to air attack and disruption. The situation that had appeared static for so long revealed itself to have been merely stretched to its breaking point. Once broken, momentum began to matter more than position. German commanders understood that they could not allow American forces to consolidate control of the valleys and lower terrain. They had to keep moving northward, establish new lines in the mountains north of Rome, and hope to rebuild defensive strength before Allied momentum became completely overwhelming. It was a race against time and physics, against mathematics and exhaustion. The human experience of this withdrawal varied dramatically depending on where one stood. For American and Polish soldiers advancing northward, it was the vindication of months of sacrifice. At last, they were moving forward, pursuing a retreating enemy rather than being pinned down by fire from prepared positions. For German soldiers conducting the withdrawal, it was the beginning of a longer, grimmer realization that the war in Italy would not be won, that Rome and everything beyond it would be lost, and that Germany's strategic position had shifted from holding territory to merely delaying the inevitable. For Italian civilians in the path of the retreat, it was chaos. German soldiers moving through their towns and villages, occasional fighting in the streets, the threat of destruction mixed with the promise of liberation by American forces. Some towns were left intact, others were partially destroyed. The monastery at Monte Cassino, now in Polish hands, sat in ruins as monks began the work of salvaging what remained of 14 centuries of history, buried under rubble and the residue of industrial warfare. The mountain had not destroyed the winter line. It had been the symptom of a broader strategic collapse, and once the symptom became undeniable, the entire system began to fail. The withdrawal of German forces from the winter line represented one of the few instances in the European war where German units managed to disengage from a strong defensive position and escape in a reasonably organized manner. It was not a strategic success. The line was still broken, Rome would still fall, and German forces would still be pushed progressively northward toward the Gothic line and eventual defeat. But it was a tactical and operational achievement in the context of retreat. Kesselring's forces avoided being surrounded and destroyed, which was the best that could be achieved when the position had been broken and retreat was the only viable option. By the 4th of June 1944, American soldiers were entering Rome itself. General Clark rode into the city at the head of his victorious army. The streets filled with Romans emerging from their homes, waving flags, cheering the Americans as liberators. It was a moment of triumph that obscured the uncomfortable reality. The battle that was supposed to have been won weeks earlier, the breakthrough that should have been swift and decisive, had instead stretched into months of grinding attrition. Rome was liberated. The winter line was broken. But the German army, though severely mauled and forced to retreat, remained intact and capable of further resistance in the mountains to the north. The breaking of the line was not the end of the story. It was merely a chapter in a much longer campaign. With Monte Cassino fallen and the monastery ruins now in Allied hands, the German defensive architecture along the winter line began to crumble. The breakthrough that commanders had sought through 4 months of grinding assault suddenly became possible. General Mark Clark, commanding the American Fifth Army, understood that the window of opportunity would not remain open indefinitely. German forces were already withdrawing from positions south and west of the captured mountain, executing what they termed a fighting retreat, but what amounted to a strategic collapse along the entire southern anchor of their Italian defense. The Liri Valley, that narrow corridor of land between the mountains and the coast that had been sealed so tightly for months, now lay exposed to exploitation. American columns could pour northward without the constant enfilade fire that had made every advance so costly. The question was no longer whether the road to Rome would open, but how quickly Allied forces could move through it before the Germans established new defensive lines further north. The soldiers moving up the valley on the heels of the German withdrawal understood that they were not simply advancing toward a city. They were pursuing a defeated enemy. The difference mattered more than any map could convey. German resistance was still present. Snipers fired from hillsides, rearguard elements conducted ambushes from prepared positions, and artillery barrages still fell upon the advancing columns. But the coordinated, disciplined defense that had characterized the winter line was fragmenting. Engineers tasked with delaying the American advance destroyed bridges and created roadblock obstacles, but they no longer had the depth of reserves to mount serious counterattacks. The German commanders knew that if they tried to hold any single line in the valley itself, they risked being outflanked by American forces pushing around their sides. Withdrawal was the only option that made military sense. Across the broken terrain south of Rome, the American Fifth Army surged forward with a momentum that had seemed impossible mere weeks before. Infantry units that had been locked in static positions for months suddenly found themselves moving rapidly, covering distances that would have cost thousands of lives had they been attempted during the winter line's heyday. Supply trucks rolled northward on roads still warm, with dust kicked up by the advancing divisions. Armored reconnaissance elements pushed ahead of the main columns, searching for German positions and mapping the roads that would carry the bulk of the army northward. The landscape itself, scarred by months of fighting, began to show signs of the transition from defensive warfare to pursuit. Abandoned German positions, some hastily evacuated, others systematically demolished by their own engineers, dotted the slopes. But the German withdrawal was disciplined and deliberate, not the chaotic flight of a routed army. While the Fifth Army moved north through the valley, another dimension of the campaign was reaching its climax. The Anzio beachhead, that bold amphibious gamble that had promised to outflank the Winter Line and accelerate Rome's liberation, had been transformed from an instrument of breakthrough into a besieged fortress. For months, the forces that had landed there in late January had been contained by German counterattacks. General John P. Lucas commanded the beachhead garrison, and he faced constant pressure from superiors to break out and link up with the forces attacking from the south. The geography of Anzio, however, worked against rapid offensive action. The beachhead was relatively shallow and constricted, surrounded by German forces who held the high ground. Any breakout attempt risked being surrounded and cut off. Lucas had chosen to consolidate and hold, enduring months of German artillery fire and the knowledge that his position was precarious. Now, as the Fifth Army advanced northward through the Liri Valley, and German forces began withdrawing from multiple positions simultaneously, the time for the Anzio beachhead to strike became critical. On the 23rd of May 1944, American forces at Anzio launched Operation Buffalo, a coordinated breakout attempt designed to link up with the advancing Fifth Army and encircle German forces in the valley. General Lucian Truscott, who had replaced Lucas, commanded forces that included armored units and infantry divisions who had endured months of shell fire and limitation. The breakout began with concentrated artillery and air support, followed by infantry and armor pushing outward from the confined beachhead perimeter. German forces, already stretched thin and unable to receive reinforcements as quickly as they were being pulled northward to resist the Fifth Army, could not contain the breakout. Within 2 days, reconnaissance elements from the beachhead met American units pushing south from the Liri Valley. The encirclement that German commanders had feared was becoming reality. The junction of the two American forces on the 25th of May marked a turning point in the campaign's psychological momentum. Soldiers who had been isolated on the beachhead suddenly found themselves part of a reconnected front. The Fifth Army, which had been fighting in the south, now had forces on its flank. General Clark's vision of a breakthrough leading to Rome suddenly seemed achievable. However, Clark faced a crucial decision about how to direct his forces in the final phase of the campaign. He could wheel westward to cut off the German retreat and encircle larger German forces in the valley, which would have been the strategically sound choice and would have destroyed more of the enemy army. Alternatively, he could drive directly north toward Rome, securing the city and achieving the political victory that would dominate headlines and serve American interests at the diplomatic level. Clark chose Rome. The decision to drive toward the city rather than complete the encirclement remains controversial among military historians even today. Strategic wisdom suggested that trapping and destroying German forces was more important than occupying any single city. The German 10th Army, commanded by General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, had been weakened but was not yet destroyed. By turning toward Rome, instead of cutting off German retreat routes, Clark allowed considerable German forces to withdraw northward and establish new defensive positions. These forces would contest American advances in subsequent months and prolong the entire Italian campaign. However, From Clark's perspective in that late May moment, Rome held enormous political value. The city had not fallen to the Allies since the Roman Empire itself. Seizing it would provide tangible evidence of progress in the Mediterranean theatre and satisfy American and British political leaders who had grown impatient with the grinding, costly campaign. American columns driving north toward Rome did so against crumbling German resistance and through territory that was increasingly offering signs of civilian liberation. The German withdrawal was accelerating, though rear elements still fought to delay the American advance and protect the flanks of withdrawing forces. Tank and mechanized infantry units lead the assault, moving rapidly along roads that had recently been contested but were now largely clear of organized resistance. Supporting aircraft, enjoying near-total air superiority, attacked German columns that attempted to form new defensive positions. The German Luftwaffe, unable to challenge American air power, had been withdrawn to positions further north, where fuel and aircraft were scarcer than ever. The sky above the advancing American columns belonged to American pilots, and they made the most of that advantage. By the 1st of June 1944, American forces were closing on Rome from the south and east. The city itself held symbolic value far beyond its military significance. Rome had been spared bombing by both the Allies and the Germans, partly out of respect for its religious and historical significance, and partly due to diplomatic agreements that recognized the city's unique status. As American soldiers entered the outskirts and began moving through the ancient city's streets, the contrast between the rubble-strewn towns they had fought through and Rome's relatively intact urban landscape became starkly apparent. Buildings stood unshattered. Monuments had not been reduced to rubble by artillery barrages. The city represented something different from the devastation of war. It represented continuity with history, with civilization, with something that transcended the immediate conflict. The 4th of June 1944 marked the moment when American soldiers entered Rome in force. The city's residents, having endured German occupation and years of warfare in the surrounding territory, poured into the streets to greet the American troops. Crowds gathered in the major piazzas, waving flags and welcoming the soldiers as liberators. American troops, exhausted from weeks of continuous combat, but buoyed by the symbolic achievement of entering Rome, accepted the adulation. Photographs and newsreel footage captured images of uniformed American soldiers, surrounded by civilians offering flowers and cheering. The moment embodied what millions of people in the Allied nations had imagined when they thought of liberation, the visible, tangible moment when enemy occupation ended and freedom was restored. General Clark entered Rome and established his headquarters in the city, basking in the immediate recognition that came from liberating the Italian capital. Press coverage was extensive and celebratory. Newspaper headlines announced the fall of Rome in triumphant language. For several days, the conquest of the city dominated news around the world. However, the larger strategic reality was more complex than the headlines conveyed. German forces had successfully withdrawn northward, maintaining their cohesion and their fighting strength. The Fifth Army had achieved a geographical objective, but the enemy army had escaped encirclement. German forces were now establishing positions along the Gothic Line, a prepared defensive system that stretched across Italy's narrowest point, hundreds of kilometers north of Rome. The campaign that was meant to achieve rapid breakthrough and create opportunities for amphibious assault on the French coast had instead consumed months and enormous resources while failing to destroy the German army in Italy. The race to Rome had concluded with American flags flying over the Italian capital and celebrating crowds filling the streets. Yet even as the rejoicing unfolded, military planners and strategists understood that this victory was not the conclusive breakthrough that had been hoped for when the Fifth Army first attacked the Winter Line 4 months earlier. The Germans had lost territory, had lost soldiers, and had lost the southern anchor of their Italian defensive system. But they had maintained their army as a fighting force, had preserved their command structure, and had positioned themselves to contest any further advance northward. The Benedictine monastery atop Monte Cassino, devastated and rebuilt by conflict, now stood behind American lines as an artifact of a campaign that had demanded far more than anyone had anticipated. Rome's liberation was genuine and significant, but it was not the end of the Italian War. It was merely a chapter's conclusion in what would become a much longer story of grinding advancement through a peninsula that had turned into a quagmire of attrition and sacrifice. In the rubble-strewn hours after Polish paratroopers planted their standard atop the shattered monastery, the scale of what had been paid for that summit became apparent. The mountain itself seemed smaller now, stripped of its power to inspire dread. Yet the cost to claim it expanded with each casualty report that filtered back through divisional headquarters. Across the sectors held by 5 nations, American, British, French, New Zealand, and Polish forces, medics moved among the wounded, while graves registration teams began the grim arithmetic of loss. The final accounting would reveal that more than 4,000 Allied soldiers had given their lives to take this single objective. Thousands more bore wounds that would mark them for the rest of their existence. Amputations, blindness, paralysis, and wounds that closed physically but never healed in the mind. By any measure of human cost, Monte Cassino had proven to be one of the war's most expensive pieces of earth, purchased not in grand maneuvers or decisive breakthroughs, but in the slow, methodical grinding of flesh and will against stone and steel. The German defenders had also paid. Estimates suggest that German casualties, killed, wounded and captured, reached somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 men, with some divisions reduced to less than half their effective strength. The 1st Paratroop Corps, which had held the mountain through all 4 assaults, had suffered such grievous losses that their units were cannibalized for reinforcements elsewhere along the Gothic line. Yet the Germans achieved something the Allies had not. They withdrew in relative good order. Despite being pushed off the mountain, Kesselring's forces did not break. The strategic withdrawal from the Winter Line proceeded with discipline and counter-attacking vigor, trading ground for time and inflicting casualties as they fell back. German engineers destroyed bridges, mined roads, and created fresh defensive positions that would slow the Allied advance northward for weeks to come. The monastery's rubble had become a fortress, yes, but it had also become a graveyard. And even in defeat, the German army maintained the tactical coherence to extract itself and fight another day, another line, another season. The physical destruction wrought upon the monastery itself stands as one of World War II's most vivid emblems of warfare's indifference to heritage. Built in the year 529 by Saint Benedict, the structure had endured 14 centuries of European history. The fall of empires, the rise and collapse of kingdoms, plagues, civil wars, and the slow accumulation of spiritual authority that only age and sanctity can bestow. The bombing of the 15th of February had transformed the abbey into smoke and shattered stone in hours. More than 250 tons of explosives fell upon a single building, obliterating the cloisters, the library, the refectory where monks had eaten in silence for generations, the bell tower whose bells had marked time for centuries. Stained glass windows depicting saints dissolved into glittering dust. Medieval manuscripts were reduced to ash. The high altar, which had witnessed the prayers of the faithful since the Renaissance, was buried under tons of collapsed masonry. In the aftermath of the bombardment, photographs showed only a jagged outline of walls, a broken crown against the sky, the building recognizable only by those who had known it before. What followed the bombing was perhaps the final indignity. German paratroopers moved into the ruins and, with brutal practicality, converted the abbey into a fortified position. They dug fighting holes among the debris. They positioned machine guns in the recesses of collapsed walls. They strung barbed wire across passages and rooms that had once echoed only with chant and contemplation. The rubble that many assumed had eliminated German advantage actually provided superior fortification, natural concealment, pre-existing positions that required minimal engineering effort, and psychological benefit for men defending the tomb of their enemy's cultural dream. German defenders reported that occupying the ruins felt almost natural, as if the destruction itself had been a gift of tactical advantage. The irony, bitter and complete, was that the bombing, intended to strip the Germans of their observation post and fortress, had instead made the German position more formidable. It was a lesson in the law of unintended consequences, written in the broken stones of a monastery that would take decades to rebuild. The reconstruction of Monte Cassino Abbey began in the 1950s, nearly a decade after the final German withdrawal. Benedictine monks oversaw the restoration with meticulous fidelity to the original structure, working from photographs and architectural records to rebuild the destroyed cloisters and chambers. The reconstruction itself became a symbol of resilience and faith, the determination to restore what war had taken, to rebuild the sacred in the aftermath of profane violence. By 1964, exactly 20 years after the bombing, the abbey was reconsecrated. The bells rang once more across the Liri Valley, calling the faithful to worship, in a building that was architecturally identical to what had been lost, yet also fundamentally new. The stones were modern stone, quarried after the war. The masonry was post-war craftsmanship. The library was rebuilt from copies of manuscripts that had been scattered before the bombing and recovered from monasteries across Europe. Everything was authentic, yet nothing was truly original, a physical paradox that reflected the post-war world's relationship with its own past. The strategic significance of the victory at Monte Cassino was immediately overshadowed by its cost and its duration. When the offensive into the Liri Valley finally began in earnest, it was not the rapid breakthrough that planners had envisioned in winter quarters. German forces retreated in good order, maintaining defensive depth and inflicting casualties as they withdrew. The road to Rome did open, and on the 4th of June 1944, American soldiers entered the capital city as crowds poured into the streets and church bells rang across the city. Yet Rome's liberation, celebrated across the Allied world as a triumph of arms, was in strategic terms almost incidental. The city's capture did not trap German forces. It did not break the German armies in Italy. Kesselring's forces simply continued their withdrawal northward, eventually stabilizing on the Gothic Line, another formidable defensive position stretching across the Apennines. The campaign that was meant to be decisive had instead become a war of attrition that would continue for another year. Across the Atlantic, in London and Washington, the cost-benefit analysis of the campaign was already being rewritten. The American resources committed to the Mediterranean, the landing craft, the divisions, the air superiority were desperately needed in the build-up to the invasion of Normandy, then less than 2 weeks away. The Anzio beachhead, meant to shorten the campaign by outflanking German defences, had instead consumed enormous quantities of supplies, reinforcements, and senior commanders' attention. By the time Monte Cassino fell, The strategic focus of the war had already shifted decisively to northern France. Italy was becoming what some called the sideshow, not meaningless, but subordinate to the grand strategy unfolding in Western Europe. The campaign that had consumed months of fighting and thousands of lives had achieved territorial gains measured in miles, not the revolutionary breakthrough planners had promised. The human cost, when measured against the strategic result, presented a troubling equation. Among the troops themselves, the victory carried a more complex character. For Polish soldiers in particular, the flag planted atop the monastery's ruins held meaning that extended beyond mere military accomplishment. Many were exiles from German-occupied Poland, men who had lost homes, families, and futures to Nazi conquest. The mountain had taken many of their comrades. The Polish Corps' assault alone cost them more than 1,000 killed and nearly 4,000 wounded to finally secure the summit. Yet for those who survived and participated in the breakthrough, there was a profound sense that they had struck back at the machinery of their oppression. The monastery's conquest, though achieved at terrible cost, represented at least some fraction of compensation for the losses their nation had endured. The photograph of Polish soldiers raising their flag on the ruins became iconic precisely because it carried that weight, not just a military achievement, but a national statement made in blood and determination. The monastery's destruction continued to reverberate through military and civilian circles long after the guns fell silent on the mountain. Questions emerged about the justification for bombing a recognized cultural monument. Had intelligence about German occupation been definitive enough to warrant destruction? Could precision bombing have achieved the military objective without obliterating the structure? Were there alternatives that commanders had not fully explored? The Vatican condemned the bombing, diplomatic tensions rose, and the incident became a focal point for discussions about the limits of military necessity in warfare. Some commanders defended the decision as militarily sound, given the intelligence available at the time. Others viewed it as a regrettable but necessary measure in the context of brutal warfare. The debate reflected a growing awareness, even in the midst of global conflict, that some costs paid in war cannot be recouped by any military advantage, that cultural destruction carried a price that extended beyond the immediate strategic calculation. The medical aftermath of the battle would play out in hospitals and homes across the Allied nations for decades. Surgeons worked around the clock to save limbs and lives. Blood banks struggled to maintain supply against the constant flow of wounded arriving from the mountain. Amputees learned to navigate a world transformed by their injuries. Men who had been whole when they climbed the mountain returned to their homes incomplete. The psychological wounds were perhaps even more profound. Soldiers haunted by the memory of comrades killed beside them, by the seemingly endless brutality, by the realization that the enemy they faced could not be beaten by courage alone. Many who survived the mountain carried the burden of that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Veterans spoke decades later of nightmares that never fully abated, of sudden sounds that returned them instantly to the slopes and the machine gun fire and the screams of the wounded. The victory on the mountain had been purchased with currency that could never be fully spent, obligations that could never be entirely discharged. German soldiers who were captured or who withdrew from the mountain also bore the marks of the campaign. Those taken prisoner were marched to camps, beginning captivity that would for many extend months beyond the war's end in Europe. German defenders who escaped northward carried the knowledge of professional defeat. They had held a strong position, fought with skill and determination, yet ultimately been driven from the field. For the professional German officer corps, the loss of Monte Cassino was less a catastrophe than an acknowledgement that the momentum of the war had turned definitively against them. Resources would become even scarcer, defensive positions would become harder to maintain, and the war's trajectory was now unmistakable. The monastery's fall signaled not the beginning of the end, but rather a confirmation that the end was now inevitable. In the years following the war, Monte Cassino acquired status as a pilgrimage site, not only for the faithful seeking to worship at a sacred shrine, but for veterans and their families seeking to comprehend what had happened on those slopes. The rebuilt monastery stands as a monument to both destruction and restoration, a physical expression of both human capacity for devastation and human determination to rebuild. Guides walk tourists through the cloisters, explain the history of the bombing, point out where fighting was heaviest. Veterans return with sons and grandsons to walk the same paths they traversed in youth, to stand at the summit and attempt to translate memory into narrative. The mountain itself has receded from strategic importance. Modern roads bypass it. Military technology has made the kind of fortified mountain position obsolete. Yet its symbolic weight has only increased. Monte Cassino stands as a monument to the grinding reality of 20th century warfare, the terrible economy of attrition, the collision of industrial killing with ancient history, the price paid when nations commit themselves fully to total war. The monastery's lessons, encoded in rubble and resurrection, persist into the present, reminding each new generation of the true cost of victory when victory requires the deaths of thousands to move forward miles, when breaking through enemy lines demands breaking also the human beings who break through them. When the Polish flag finally rose above the shattered monastery on the 18th of May 1944, exhausted commanders and political leaders across the Mediterranean felt the weight of what should have been triumph. The mountain was taken, the winter line, that supposedly impenetrable barrier constructed with German precision across the Italian peninsula, had been pierced. Rome lay open. By every calculation that had seemed rational 6 months earlier, victory was at hand. Yet as Allied forces pressed northward and German columns began their retreat, a troubling reality emerged from beneath the celebration. The campaign that was supposed to end quickly had consumed more than 5 months of grinding, attritional warfare. The resources committed had grown far beyond original estimates. The casualties had mounted into the tens of thousands, and most critically, the German army remained intact. Bloodied, yes, but organized and dangerous, slipping away northward toward prepared defensive positions rather than dissolving into rout and surrender. The original vision behind the winter campaign in Italy had been elegantly simple, at least in conception. Break through the winter line quickly, suppress German resistance south of Rome, drive the Fifth Army northward to link with forces from the Anzio beachhead, which would cut German supply lines and trap enemy formations between Hammer and Anvil. The entire operation was supposed to unfold over weeks, not months. Resources and momentum would then shift toward Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France, which planners knew would demand every available ship, every trained soldier, every reserve of ammunition and fuel the Allies could gather. The Mediterranean campaign was meant to be a supporting theatre. Important, yes, but fundamentally subordinate to the main effort that would come on the Normandy coast. Instead, the mountain had become a black hole, consuming men and material in quantities that challenged the entire Allied strategy.